History is often told like a story of progress. We like to imagine a straight line. People were once primitive, violent, ignorant, and now with technology, democracy, and comfort, we are civilized, smarter, better. But if you look closely, history isn't a straight line. It's a loop. Over and over, civilizations rise with confidence, only to stumble on the same mistakes. Empires collapse for reasons their ancestors already knew. Crowds fall for the same fears. Leaders ignore warnings that were written in ruins centuries earlier. And here's the most disturbing part. We don't just forget history, we actively erase it. Each generation believes it is different, special, immune. We look at the disasters of the past as if they were museum exhibits, when in reality, they are mirrors. This video is not about dates or dusty textbooks. It's about the patterns that never die. The lessons humanity has already learned and then abandoned. The traps we still fall into, even while pretending to be wiser. Across 60 chapters, we'll walk through the dark lessons of history. From the bread riots that toppled kings, to the empires that believed they would last forever, to the civilizations that vanished almost overnight. Some of these stories are strange, some are horrifying, some are uncomfortably familiar. And all of them matter, because they reveal something about where we are heading now. If you're listening here on Overthinker, you already know the world isn't as simple as the headlines make it. The past is not just a warning, it's a prophecy. And unless we face these lessons, we'll keep repeating them. So let's begin, not with kings or empires, but with something far more ordinary, something you see every day, and maybe even take for granted: bread. Because the story of bread is also the story of revolt, collapse, and the hunger that rewrites history. The bread that broke kingdoms. When people imagine revolutions, they often think of grand speeches, fiery manifestos, or crowds waving flags in the streets. But history tells us a quieter, more unsettling truth. Revolutions usually begin with hunger. Not with philosophy, not with politics, but with something as ordinary as the price of bread. Take Paris in 1789. The city was restless, its markets unstable, and bread prices were rising faster than wages could keep up. For the poor, bread wasn't a luxury, it was survival. The average working-class family spent up to 80% of its income on bread alone. Imagine that, 4 out of every 5 coins in your pocket going just to buy enough to keep your children alive. When that daily loaf doubled in price, it wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a death sentence. We remember the French Revolution for stormed palaces, guillotines, and declarations of liberty. But its spark was simpler. Crowds of desperate women marched to Versailles, demanding bread. When the king couldn't answer, the monarchy itself began to unravel. History never forgave Marie Antoinette for supposedly saying, "Let them eat cake," even though she likely never uttered the phrase. It didn't matter. In the minds of the starving, the story was enough. It captured the distance between rulers and ruled, the elite so insulated they could not imagine life without abundance. But this lesson is far older than France. Ancient Rome kept its citizens loyal, not through philosophy or patriotism, but through grain, bread, and circuses. That was the formula. As long as the state distributed cheap grain from its conquered provinces, the people would tolerate corruption, war, and even tyranny. But when the grain shipments were disrupted, riots would shake the capital. Roman politicians knew that losing a war abroad was survivable, but running out of grain at home could bring down the empire itself. We like to think we are beyond such fragility, but history keeps repeating this pattern. In the 20th century, the Arab world faced rising bread prices again and again, each time triggering unrest. In 1977, riots erupted in Egypt after subsidies on bread were cut. In 1984, Morocco burned with protests over food shortages. And in 2010, when a Tunisian fruit seller set himself on fire after his livelihood was destroyed, the anger spread like wildfire. Within months, regimes across North Africa and the Middle East were collapsing. We remember this as the Arab Spring. But behind the slogans and social media, there was once again the same old spark: hunger. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Revolutions rarely begin because people want freedom in the abstract. They begin when life becomes physically unlivable. When people can't eat, ideas become weapons. Philosophies become banners. Leaders are toppled not by intellectual arguments, but by empty stomachs. And yet, rulers never seem to learn this. Again and again, they treat food security as a minor issue, while focusing on wars, monuments, or political rivalries. They forget that no speech can silence hunger, and no army can shoot down an appetite. A king can survive losing territory, but he cannot survive a breadline that grows too long. Even today, you can watch this lesson unfolding. Global wheat supplies remain fragile, tied to wars and climate shifts. In 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, grain exports were disrupted and prices spiked across the world. In places like Lebanon, families suddenly couldn't afford their daily bread. Politicians debated strategy, but on the street the lesson was the same as it had always been. When food runs short, patience disappears. So what is the dark lesson here? That governments, empires, and civilizations often believe their survival depends on armies, borders, or ideology. But the truth is simpler. Their survival depends on bread. History is not only written by philosophers or generals, it is written in the markets, in the kitchens, in the gnawing of an empty stomach. And if you're listening closely, you might notice the eerie pattern. Every era believes hunger is a relic of the past, a problem solved by progress. Yet every era discovers, often violently, that civilization is only ever a few missed meals away from collapse. We think of bread as ordinary, but history remembers it as explosive. The loaf on the table is more powerful than the sword on the wall, and kingdoms have broken because rulers forgot that simple truth. The machine that replaced hands. When we talk about automation today, the story usually starts with AI, robots, and assembly lines. But that's not where it began. The instinct to replace human effort with mechanical precision is much older, and its consequences just as deep. Go back 2,000 years to the city of Alexandria in Egypt. There, a Greek engineer named Hero built machines powered by steam, pressure, and even programmable instructions. He designed automatic doors, coin-operated dispensers, and even a miniature theater that could perform scripted plays using pulleys and rotating drums. It sounds like science fiction, but it was real. And here's the dark part. They never used it to replace labor because the economy didn't need machines. It had slaves. Manual labor was cheap, and as long as power was tied to owning people, there was no incentive to automate anything. So the ideas were forgotten, buried, ignored for centuries. It wasn't until machines could replace paid workers that automation became profitable. Fast forward to the Industrial Revolution. Textile mills in England were among the first to adopt mechanical looms, replacing hundreds of skilled weavers with one machine and a child to tend it. Factories exploded in size, productivity soared, but entire trades vanished overnight. The people who had spent decades mastering a craft were now obsolete. And when they protested, when the Luddites smashed the machines, they were branded enemies of progress. This is the story we still tell, that technology inevitably replaces people, and we should just adapt, but it's not that simple. Automation doesn't just destroy jobs, it reshapes entire structures of power. The factory didn't just replace the craftsman, it concentrated production into fewer hands. It created managers, owners, and wage workers, a hierarchy built on the machine. And that's still happening today. Self-checkout replaces the cashier. AI replaces the writer, the artist, the teacher. Not always because it's better, but because it's cheaper, faster, and doesn't complain. And the profits don't go to the machines. They go to the few who own them. This is the real risk of automation. Not just that you'll lose your job, but that you'll lose bargaining power. Because once a task is automated, it becomes scalable, and scalable work doesn't pay well. We pretend that automation frees us. But most of the time, it just changes who benefits. In ancient Alexandria, they didn't need machines because they had slaves. Today, the machines do the work. But the ownership hasn't changed. A few people at the top still benefit. The rest? We adapt, or we get replaced. The lesson isn't to fear automation, it's to understand what it replaces and who it empowers. Because every time a machine takes over, it's not just the work that disappears, it's the dignity, the leverage, the place in the system. And once that's gone, you don't just need a new skill, you need a new role in a world that may no longer need you. The memory that fades, lessons erased within a generation. If someone asked you to name 3 lessons from history we've actually learned, could you do it? Now flip the question. Name 3 horrifying mistakes humanity keeps repeating. That one's easier. War, greed, collapse. We know the stories. We say never again. And yet again. Why? Because the most powerful force in history isn't war. It's forgetting. Not all at once, not overnight. It starts small. A detail skipped. A name misremembered. A context lost. And then, within a generation or two, it's not even history anymore. It's myth, rumor, or just irrelevant. Take the Great Depression. Millions lost jobs. Banks collapsed. Families lined up for bread. So in response, nations built systems to prevent another crash. Banking regulations, safety nets, social programs. But fast forward a few decades, and those same protections are labeled excessive, wasteful, or anti-growth. New generations who never lived through the collapse see the safeguards as obstacles, not warnings. And then, the 2008 crash. It's not that people were evil or stupid. It's that the memory had faded, those who remembered were gone, and those in charge had only read about it in textbooks, if at all. This pattern is everywhere. After World War I, the world swore it would never allow that kind of carnage again. People remembered the trenches, the gas, the senseless charges into machine guns. But by the 1930s, a new generation saw war not as horror, but as strategy. By 1939, the world was on fire again, even nuclear weapons. The ultimate historical lesson are becoming abstract. The world watched Hiroshima and Nagasaki turn to ash. It stunned humanity into restraint. But most people alive today weren't there. They've never seen the footage, never heard the first-hand accounts. For them, nuclear war is a vague threat, not a real possibility. That's how history disappears. Not by being erased, but by becoming unfelt. Schools reduce it to dates and names. Movies rewrite it with heroes and drama, and slowly we stop seeing it as something that happened to people like us. We forget that the people who lived through these events weren't the past. They were real, breathing humans, making choices, facing fears, falling for lies. And if we forget their mistakes, we inherit them. There's a phrase often repeated in military circles: all war is refought by the grandchildren of the people who swore it would never happen again. Because trauma doesn't pass through facts, it passes through experience. And when the experience fades, the safeguards go with it. Think about pandemics. After 1918, there was fear, masks, warnings. By the 1920s, people were dancing in clubs. By the 1930s, they were shaking hands, coughing in crowds, forgetting, until the next one hit. And yes, after COVID, we said never again. But watch how quickly the memory will fade. Watch how we'll start cutting funding, closing systems, removing infrastructure, because remembering is uncomfortable, and forgetting is easy. That's the real danger. Not ignorance, but apathy. Not the absence of knowledge, but the erosion of meaning. We build statues, write books, hold ceremonies. But if the lesson doesn't stick, it doesn't matter. And unless we make remembering a living practice, we're not honoring history, we're We're just setting the stage for a rerun. The Plantation Trap. Imagine betting your entire life savings on a single stock. Now imagine building an entire economy, a colony, or a civilization on that same kind of gamble. That's what monoculture is. One crop, one resource, one fragile dependency, and time again, it has led entire societies to ruin. Start with something as innocent as a banana. In the early 20th century, Central America was flooded with U.S. companies planting bananas on massive plantations. It seemed like a miracle, fast-growing, profitable, in high demand in the U.S. countries, like Honduras, Guatemala, and Costa Rica, saw a flood of investment. Railroads were built, ports modernized, jobs created. The banana wasn't just a fruit, it was a foundation, but monocultures are delicate. By focusing everything on a single crop, you destroy resilience. Banana plantations clear-cut forests, drained wetlands, and planted the same variety of banana, the Gros Michel, across thousands of acres. Then came a fungus. It didn't matter how modern the plantation looked. When the disease hit, it hit everything at once, because everything was genetically identical. By the 1950s, the entire Gros Michel banana industry collapsed. Billions lost. Jobs vanished. Countries destabilized. But this wasn't new. Back in Ireland, in the 1840s, the economy had done the same with potatoes. For millions of Irish families, the potato wasn't just a staple, it was survival. Easy to grow, calorie-dense, adaptable, but they weren't planting a variety. They were planting clones. And when potato blight struck, the result wasn't just a crop failure, it was a famine. Over 1 million people died, 2 million more fled the country, and the economic damage lasted generations. The logic is always the same. Pick one thing that works. Scale it. Depend on it. Ignore the risk. Because when it's working, it feels unstoppable. Until it stops. In the American South, cotton monoculture did the same. It made fortunes, then drained the soil, depleted nutrients, and left the land barren. Today, cotton farming in some regions still struggles to recover from the damage done a century ago. Why do societies fall for this trap? Because monocultures are efficient, they offer short-term gains, simplicity, scalability, profit. But what they erase is diversity, and in nature and in economies, diversity is what makes systems survive shocks. One disease, one pest, one economic downturn, and the whole structure collapses. The same applies to ideas, too. When a culture or institution fixates on one ideology, one method, one answer, it becomes fragile. Because it no longer knows how to adapt. And today, we're still doing it. Think about tech monopolies, energy dependence, global supply chains focused on single countries or single points of failure. When everything runs on one thing, from software to soybeans, you're not building a future, you're building a time bomb. The plantation trap is seductive, but what it offers in efficiency, it steals in resilience. And when the crisis comes, it doesn't just take the crop, it takes everything with it. The market panic. It always starts the same way. A boom, optimism, easy profits. People whispering that this time, it's different, that the old rules don't apply, that if you're smart, you'll get in now, before it's too late. And then, suddenly, it is too late. Markets are supposed to be rational. That's the myth. That prices reflect information, that value emerges from logic, that risk is measured, managed, and contained. But history disagrees. Take the Dutch tulip craze in the 1630s. Yes, tulips, the flower. At the height of the bubble, a single rare tulip bulb could sell for more than a skilled worker's yearly wage. Some bulbs went for the price of a house. Speculators didn't even trade real flowers, just promises to deliver flowers in the future. Futures contracts. The illusion of ownership, and when spring came and the contracts were due, everyone realized they'd been trading air. The market collapsed in days. It wasn't because tulips stopped being beautiful. It was because trust disappeared. But if you think that's absurd, consider the South Sea Bubble of 1720. A British trading company promised vast profits from trade with South America, a region they didn't actually have access to. Investors didn't care. Shares soared. Politicians got involved. Even Isaac Newton invested. When asked why he didn't stay in longer, Newton reportedly said, "I can calculate the motions of the heavens, but not the madness of men." He wasn't joking. He lost a fortune. This cycle isn't unique. It happened in 1929, when stocks in America were bought on margin, borrowed money, inflating prices far beyond actual value. When confidence cracked, the collapse wasn't gentle. The Great Depression followed. It happened in Japan in the 1980s, when real estate in Tokyo became more valuable than the entire state of California. It happened with dot-com stocks in the early 2000s. It happened again with mortgage-backed securities in 2008. It will happen again, because bubbles aren't about the asset, they're about psychology. When prices rise, people feel smart for joining in. As the crowd grows, doubt feels stupid. Greed feels logical. And anyone who warns of danger is told they just don't get it. Until panic hits. Then the logic flips. Selling becomes urgent. Prices fall not because of reality, but because everyone believes they will. People don't wait for information. They run. And the faster they run, the more everyone else panics. The collapse isn't the opposite of the boom. It's its mirror. This is the terrifying part. Markets aren't driven by information. They're driven by belief, and belief is contagious. When a market panics, it doesn't matter what's real. What matters is what people think is real and how fast they can move before the next person does. And this doesn't just happen with money. The same dynamic appears in politics, in media, in social movements, even in war. A surge of belief. A bandwagon. An inflated sense of certainty. Then doubt. Then collapse. We think we're smarter now. That algorithms and models and risk metrics can prevent catastrophe. But the people who built those models are still people, prone to fear. Hype. Herd behavior. If history teaches us anything, it's this: the smarter we think we are, the more dangerous the crash becomes. Because confidence is not the opposite of panic. It's how panic begins. The company that ruled nations. We're used to the idea that governments rule and companies serve. Governments make laws. Companies follow them. That's how it's supposed to work. But history tells a very different story. There was a time when a company didn't just make products or sell services. It ruled over millions of people, commanded armies, collected taxes, and even triggered wars. And it all began, not with tyranny, but with trade. In the early 1600s, Britain wanted a piece of the booming spice trade, so a group of investors formed what seemed like a practical idea, a trading company called the East India Company. They pooled their money, got a royal charter, and set out to do business overseas. But instead of simply buying and selling goods, the company began acting like a government. It built forts. It hired mercenaries. It bribed local rulers. It overthrew them when the bribes stopped working. Over time, it stopped asking for permission, and no one stopped it. By the 1700s, this single company was controlling more people than most empires. It became the de facto ruler of India, not because it wanted to help anyone there, but because it wanted control. Control over land, over trade, over labor. It dictated what could be grown, and for whom. It banned local industries that threatened British exports. It taxed grain during droughts and raised prices during famine. It was profit sharpened into policy, and the effects were devastating. Villages collapsed. Craftsmen were ruined. Famines killed millions. But back in London, the investors celebrated record dividends. It's easy to look at that story and see it as a strange artifact of colonial history, a mistake we learned from and left behind. But look around. We still live in a world where corporations operate beyond borders, accountable not to citizens, but to shareholders. A company doesn't need an army anymore. It only needs algorithms, or patents, or distribution control. One company controls most of the world's seeds. Another controls the global supply of smartphones. Several decide what information spreads and what disappears. And in many ways, that's more power than any historical empire ever had. Because now, it's invisible. No one voted for it. There are no term limits, no constitution, no checks and balances, just a terms of service agreement, the kind you click without reading. We've accepted a world where platforms decide what is real, where manufacturers dictate what's repairable, where companies influence laws before they're even written. And every time we say, well, that's just how business works, we forget what history already showed us. Business can rule, and it has. And when it does, the values of commerce often replace the values of humanity, not out of malice, out of optimization. The East India Company never set out to become an empire. It just found that empire was profitable, and no one told it to stop. Today's companies might not fly flags or mint coins, but they do something far more powerful. They define the default, and once something becomes the default, it stops feeling like a choice. The tax trap. Every government needs money. That part is simple. Roads don't build themselves. Armies don't march for free. Bureaucracies require salaries, parliaments require palaces, and royal families tend to enjoy gold-threaded curtains. So taxes, in theory, are a necessary evil, the price we pay for civilization. But in history, taxation rarely feels like a shared responsibility. More often, it becomes a slow act of violence, one receipt at a time. Ask the French peasants in the years before the Revolution. While the nobility and clergy paid little or nothing, farmers were crushed under a stack of demands: land tax, salt tax, income tax, church tax, and whatever extra the local lord felt like adding. Even transporting grain from one region to another required dozens of permits and tolls. And then, after surviving all that, they'd arrive at a market where bread was still unaffordable. It wasn't just the weight of the taxes. It was who paid and who didn't. One famous satirist at the time described the French tax system as a cow being milked by thousands of hands, most of them nowhere near the udder. And when the revolution came, the mob wasn't just angry at the king. They were angry at the tax collectors. But this pattern wasn't unique to France. In imperial China, the tax burden would often rise quietly as the dynasty aged. The emperor, needing more funds to manage a vast and increasingly corrupt system, would demand more silver from his officials. The officials, not wanting to anger the emperor or the people directly, would outsource tax collection to local contractors. Those contractors, well, they had incentives. It became common for poor farmers to lose their land, not because of war or famine, but because they couldn't pay the ever-growing, opaque, and arbitrary taxes levied by private collectors. It's not hard to imagine the resentment that would grow in a village where the taxman lives in a marble house while his neighbors starve. Even Rome, with all its glory, wasn't immune. In the late Empire, Roman citizens began to abandon their land and flee into the forests simply to escape taxation. Some literally sold themselves into slavery under wealthy landowners, because being a slave on an estate was less punishing than being a free taxpayer. And when taxpayers flee, the burden shifts to those who remain, which leads to more flight. And more burden. It's a loop, a self-tightening noose around the neck of the state. The cycle has repeated in empire after empire, a golden age of growth and conquest that leads to an era of splendor, and then comes the cost. Maintaining it all, the armies, the roads, the borders, the bureaucracy, becomes a balancing act. But instead of shrinking the system, rulers usually try to squeeze more from those beneath it, until they squeeze too hard. In 1381, England's monarchy tried to enforce a third poll tax, a fixed tax on every person, regardless of wealth. That last push was enough. A peasant revolt broke out. They marched to London. They murdered tax officials. They demanded justice. And they almost succeeded in toppling the entire system. Now here's where things get strange. The more advanced a civilization becomes, the more invisible taxation gets. We don't call it tribute or tithes anymore. We call it processing fees, inflation adjustments, value added. It arrives through the price of eggs, the rent you pay, or the things that used to be free. It's not that different, really. The mechanics have changed. The pressure hasn't. And in every age, there's the same illusion, that the poor are lazy and the rich are contributing more than anyone. But when you pull back the curtain, you often find the wealthiest paying lawyers instead of taxes, while the rest pay quietly, monthly, without applause or recognition. Same story, new calendar. Civilizations don't collapse the moment a tax is too high. They collapse when people stop believing the system is worth supporting, when citizens begin to feel like subjects again. When they look at their leaders and realize the price of loyalty is too high, so they stop paying, not just in money, but in trust. And when trust leaves the treasury, no empire lasts long. The coin that corrupted trust. At first glance, a coin is just a piece of metal, small, heavy, stamped with some symbol of a king or a country. But that little disc carries more than value. It carries trust. It says, this is worth something. You can give it to someone else tomorrow, and they'll believe it too. But what happens when the symbol is still there, and the value isn't? Ancient Rome figured this out the hard way. In the early empire, Roman coins were solid. A silver denarius was nearly pure, respected everywhere from Britain to Egypt. It was the gold standard before gold standards existed. Merchants accepted Roman currency, not just out of law, but because it worked. The weight matched the promise. But empires grow, and they get expensive. By the 3rd century, Rome was running out of options. Endless wars on the frontiers. Lavish spending by emperors trying to buy loyalty. Infrastructure decaying under its own complexity. Raising taxes sparked riots. Borrowing wasn't an option, so they turned to something else. Debasement. They started minting coins with less silver and more cheap metal. First 90% silver, then 70%, then 50%. Eventually, some coins were less than 5% silver, coated with just enough to shine before it rubbed off in your hand. The symbol on the coin stayed the same. The face of the emperor still looked proud, but the people knew. Prices rose. Merchants demanded more coins for the same goods. Inflation wasn't a hidden force. It was a public betrayal. Eventually, people stopped trusting the currency altogether. Trade collapsed in some regions. Soldiers demanded payment in actual goods, grain, livestock, weapons, rather than worthless coins. The economy fractured. And when money stops working, civilization doesn't lag far behind. But this isn't just a Roman story. In the 16th century, Spain imported massive amounts of silver and gold from the Americas. At first, it seemed like the greatest financial windfall in history. But all that treasure flooded Europe's economy, and prices soared, wages stagnated. The poor suffered. Silver lost meaning, and eventually so did Spain's dominance. Centuries later, in revolutionary France, they tried paper money, assignats, backed by confiscated church land. It worked for a brief moment, but they printed more. And more. Inflation spiraled. Bread cost more each day. People lost faith. And once again, a financial solution turned into a political catastrophe. Here's what history keeps showing us. Once money loses meaning, trust becomes impossible. Not just in currency, but in everything tied to it, because coins don't just buy bread. They pay soldiers. They fund governments. They keep the gears turning quietly, invisibly, until they don't. A coin with no real value is like a promise with no intention. Eventually, people notice. And when they do, the illusion breaks. Even today, we live in a world of abstract numbers, digital accounts, trillions created at will. We tell ourselves it's fine, that systems are stable, that inflation is under control, that money isn't backed by metal but by confidence. But that's the thing, confidence can vanish faster than silver. In every age, leaders have told themselves they could cheat just a little, clip the coins, print more paper, stretch the promise. But trust is like glass, clear, strong, and invisible, until it cracks. And when it cracks, you can't put it back together with speeches. The Roman coin still looked Roman long after it had become meaningless. The danger wasn't visible. It was weightless, like rust in the soul of an empire. That's what corruption looks like when it's quiet, not scandal, not theft, but decay. A little less value in every promise, every transaction, every exchange. Until one day, no one believes the symbol anymore. And that's when systems fall. The debt that enslaves generations. Debt is easy to ignore when it's small. A promise to pay back later. A delay. A favor. A tool. Until it isn't. Until it becomes a chain you hand to your children. In the ancient world, debt didn't just mean stress, it meant slavery. In early Mesopotamia, if you borrowed grain and couldn't repay, your daughter might be taken instead. In Athens, poor farmers would scratch the names of their debts into stone markers outside their homes. If they failed to pay, they could be sold into servitude. Entire families disappeared this way. Eventually, Solon, one of Athens' early reformers, came to power and did something radical. He canceled all debts, not just the interest. The principal. Everything. He banned debt slavery and destroyed the records. He called it the shaking off of burdens, seisachtheia, and it may have saved Athenian democracy before it was even born. But not everyone forgave so easily. In Rome, debt was a time bomb. Citizens who couldn't pay their creditors were imprisoned or forced to work off their debts, sometimes for life. Even after serving, the stigma remained. Debtors were seen as morally suspect, lazy, irresponsible, lesser. But the truth was more brutal. A single bad harvest, a late payment, or a corrupt official could send an honest farmer into ruin. The problem wasn't just personal, it was structural. Roman elites lent money to the poor with high interest, then used their debts as leverage to seize land. Over time, wealth consolidated. The small landowner disappeared. And by the time of the late Republic, a few families controlled most of the wealth, while the rest struggled to survive. Sound familiar? You don't have to go back to Rome. In medieval Europe, peasant farmers often worked land they didn't own, paying rent in crops and labor. If they couldn't meet the quota, their children inherited the obligation. In effect, poverty became hereditary, not through genetics, but through contracts. Even today, debt shapes destinies. Student loans, medical bills, mortgage traps. Nations born into the debt of colonial exploitation. Whole economies structured to serve creditors over citizens. And yet, just like in ancient times, we're told it's a moral issue, that those who fall into debt must have done something wrong. But history suggests something else. Debt is often a tool of control disguised as a contract of trust. It turns poverty into a prison that looks voluntary. And when the numbers get too large, when repayment becomes mathematically impossible, the shame doesn't disappear. It multiplies. It passes down. Generational debt is a silent thief. It doesn't take your life all at once. It takes it hour by hour. It shapes your choices, shrinks your dreams, replaces freedom with obligation. And the longer a society ignores it, the more dangerous it becomes. Because debt can be managed until it becomes resentment. And resentment, when passed down long enough, doesn't stay silent forever. The greed spiral. Greed doesn't need to look evil. It rarely does. Most of the time, it looks like ambition, growth, success, efficiency, a bigger house, a better position, a slightly higher return. But history shows us something disturbing. When greed becomes systemic, when everyone is incentivized to take more, it creates a spiral, and spirals don't stop on their own. Consider the fall of the Roman Republic. It wasn't destroyed by barbarians or betrayal. It was strangled by accumulation. Powerful elites, flush with the spoils of conquest, began to buy up land, a lot of land. They forced small farmers to sell, often after taxing them into desperation. Those farmers moved into cities, jobless, angry, dependent on the state for food. Meanwhile, the rich got richer, and the Senate, mostly made up of landowners, they passed laws to protect their estates. To the average Roman citizen, the system no longer felt like a republic. It felt like an auction house, and the bidders were always the same families. Then came populists. Promises, riots, assassinations sound distant. Try industrial America in the late 19th century. Robber barons built monopolies, crushed competition, and treated labor as disposable. They called it progress. Some workers called it slavery with paperwork. When inequality reached its peak, protests turned violent. The government stepped in, not to protect the people, but to protect the profits. Even now, it plays out in slower motion. Corporations use tax loopholes to store billions offshore. Wages stagnate while executive pay soars. Workers are told to tighten their belts during economic downturns, while stock buybacks hit record highs. Everyone sees it. No one seems able to stop it. Because once greed becomes normalized, once more becomes the default, stepping back feels like losing. Companies can't slow down. CEOs can't admit enough is enough. Governments can't regulate without angering the donors they rely on. The system eats itself, and the spiral continues. Profits demand cuts. Cuts cause suffering. Suffering breeds instability. Instability demands more profit to calm the markets. It's not about villains. It's about incentives. When systems reward extraction over creation, hoarding over sharing, power over service, the spiral deepens. Greed, left unchecked, doesn't just hurt individuals. It rewires the culture. And once a society stops asking, do we have enough, and starts asking only, how can we get more? History shows us what comes next. Collapse. The price of progress. Every generation believes it's living in the most advanced moment in history, and it's usually right. We have antibiotics, satellites, smartphones, global networks, and self-driving cars. In some ways, the world your grandparents imagined only in science fiction is already behind us. But here's the thing no one likes to talk about. Progress always costs more than we think. Take the Industrial Revolution. On the surface, it was miraculous. Machines replaced manual labor. Productivity exploded. Life expectancy began to rise. For the first time, an ordinary person could imagine a future that wasn't just survival, but look closer. Those early factories, they ran on child labor, 12-hour shifts, no safety regulations. Workers losing fingers or lungs while churning out cotton for distant markets. Cities swelled with smoke. Rivers ran black. The air was poison. London was so polluted by coal smoke that it triggered epidemics of respiratory disease for decades, all for the sake of progress. In the United States, the spread of the railroad opened the continent and shattered indigenous nations. Telephones connected families and later enabled surveillance. Pesticides saved crops and polluted ecosystems. Plastic solved packaging and now clogs oceans and enters our blood. The irony is sharp. Every step forward carries a shadow. We automate jobs and then wonder why people feel useless. We build digital connections and then watch loneliness spike. We create abundance and yet depression rates rise. Because the tools we invent often outpace the wisdom we need to use them, and no civilization likes to slow down. When the atom was split in the 20th century, it was hailed as the pinnacle of human understanding. Energy from matter. Science triumphing over nature. Then came Hiroshima. It's not that progress is bad. It's that we rarely pause to ask, progress toward what? Who benefits? Who pays? What parts of ourselves are we trading away? Today, we cheer for AI breakthroughs, quantum computing, synthetic biology, and they are remarkable. But if history teaches anything, it's this. No invention stays in its original box. The same machine that powers a hospital can also power a drone. The same algorithm that helps you find a movie can help manipulate an election. The same social network that connects you can trap you. Progress doesn't care about morals. It just asks, can this be done? It's up to us to ask, should it? And if we don't, we may wake up in a world more advanced than ever, but one we no longer recognize or control. The plague that changed the world. Disaster usually feels like the end of the story, but history shows us something stranger and more unsettling. Plagues don't just kill, they rewrite everything. In the 14th century, the Black Death swept through Europe like fire through dry grass. No one knew what caused it. The air smelled wrong. The stars seemed misaligned. Some blamed witches, others blamed God. But it didn't matter. The disease didn't care what you believed. By the time it was over, nearly half the population of Europe was gone. Entire villages vanished. Cities became ghost towns. Fields went unplowed. Priests, doctors, nobles, peasants, death didn't discriminate. It was one of the most terrifying periods in human history. But then, something unexpected happened. With so many dead, there were fewer workers. Suddenly, peasants could demand higher wages. Landowners needed them more than they needed land. Serfs, who had been tied to estates for generations, began to move, to negotiate, to leave. Labor became valuable. It didn't lead to utopia, but it broke the old system. The plague cracked the spine of feudalism. It set the stage for the Renaissance, for new ideas about individual worth, for revolutions in science, medicine, and politics. A catastrophe had reshuffled the entire social order, and it's not the only time. In ancient Athens, a plague struck during the Peloponnesian War. It killed Pericles, their greatest leader. It shattered public morale and fueled radical shifts in government, including a rise in demagogues who played on fear. In the 1918 influenza pandemic, more people died than in World War I. Whole generations were scarred. And afterward, public health, medicine, and even gender roles began to shift, as women, who had filled labor gaps, refused to return to the shadows. Even recently, we've seen echoes. The COVID-19 pandemic didn't just change how we work or travel. It exposed fault lines in our economies, our healthcare systems, and our sense of trust in institutions. Millions of people began to question how things had been working, or not working, all along. Plagues have a strange power. They pause everything. They break momentum, and in that pause, the shape of society becomes visible, raw, vulnerable, exposed. We see who is protected and who isn't, who gets care and who gets forgotten, which systems bend and which ones snap. Then, when the disease fades, we are left with choices: to rebuild what we had, or to imagine something different. The plague doesn't tell us what to do. It just removes the illusion that things can stay the same. The eternal empire illusion. Every empire tells itself the same story, that it is different, that it is enlightened, that its power is not like the others, not fragile, not corrupt, not temporary, that it will last. But history suggests otherwise. The Akkadian Empire in Mesopotamia was once the pride of the ancient world. Its rulers believed their gods had chosen them to bring order to chaos. For a time they did. Then drought came. Rebellion spread. Cities emptied. The empire evaporated like mist. The Egyptians built monuments so massive they assumed eternity. They carved their victories into stone, preserved their kings in gold-lined tombs, and engineered an image of permanence that survives today. But that permanence was an illusion. Egypt fell not once, but many times to Hyksos invaders, to Libyan dynasties, to Persian rule, to Rome. Its culture remained, yes, but its power bled out across centuries. Rome is the textbook example. At its height, it seemed unbreakable. Roads across continents, a professional army, sprawling bureaucracy, literature, law, trade. It ruled for over 1,000 years, but it rotted from within. Greed hollowed out its institutions. Political violence became routine. Loyalty was bought with land and coin. Borders stretched too far. Refugees fled into the empire. And Rome, instead of integrating them, panicked. It built walls. It blamed outsiders. It demanded more from its citizens until those citizens walked away. And then it ended, not in a blaze of glory, but in fragments. Local kings. Forgotten provinces. A whisper of what had been. Still, every empire after believed it had found the secret formula. The Ottomans, the Mongols, the British, the Soviets. Each believed its system, its ideology, its technology, its divine right would make it permanent. They were wrong. Today we look around and still hear that same story, that certain nations, certain systems, certain currencies, certain ideas will last forever. We call them global orders, superpowers, the end of history. But permanence is a story we tell ourselves to feel safe, because to admit the truth, that everything built can crumble, is terrifying. Empires don't fall because they're weak. They fall because they forget they can fall. And by the time they remember, it's already happening. The succession curse. An empire can conquer the world and still fall apart trying to figure out who gets the throne. Because for all their armies, advisors, and laws, most empires collapse over something surprisingly basic: who comes next? Take Alexander the Great. He carved an empire from Greece to India before the age of 33. No one could stop him. But when he died, suddenly, without a clear heir, his generals tore everything apart. The result? 40 years of war. Brothers turned on brothers. Cities burned. His empire fractured into pieces that never fit back together. Why? Because there was no plan. The same thing happened in the Mongol Empire. Genghis Khan united the tribes, built the largest contiguous empire in history, and passed it on. Sort of. His descendants fought constantly over succession. Brothers killed cousins. Territories were split. The empire shrank not because of outside enemies, but because no one could agree on who wore the crown. You'd think the Romans would have learned, but no. The Roman Empire never had a clear rule for succession. Sometimes the emperor appointed a son. Sometimes he adopted an heir. Sometimes the army picked someone. Sometimes they just waited. In one infamous year, 69 CE, Rome had 4 emperors. Each claimed legitimacy. Each was backed by different legions. And each met a violent end, until finally Vespasian seized control. The only thing more dangerous than a bad emperor was an unclear transition. Even the Ottoman Empire, which lasted centuries, had a gruesome solution. Upon taking the throne, a new sultan would strangle all his brothers with a silken cord to prevent civil war. They believed fratricide was cleaner than succession crises. In a way, they weren't wrong. Because when power becomes a throne, not a system, everything depends on personality. You can have a brilliant ruler who keeps peace, builds roads, reforms laws. But if the next in line is weak, cruel, or simply unsure, it can all unravel in a generation. And the more centralized the empire, the worse the collapse. We often imagine empire as permanent, like a marble statue. But succession shows us how fragile it really is. Power isn't inherited, it's negotiated. And those negotiations often involve armies. Even today, the pattern persists. We've seen countries fall into chaos after the death or removal of a long-serving leader. No system in place, no clear line, just a scramble for control, and the people caught in the middle. Because succession isn't just about who leads. It's about whether the system can survive without them. And history's answer is, not often. The Mercenary Gamble. At first, it feels like a simple solution. You have a problem. You need something done. You can't do it yourself. So you hire someone, a specialist, a contractor, someone with no attachment, no emotional stake, just a task and a price. And as long as the deal works, it feels efficient, professional, clean. Until one day, you realize you've outsourced your power. You see this all the time in real life. A company grows too big to manage its own infrastructure, so it hires an outside firm. Another firm for security, another for marketing, another for hiring. Eventually, the company doesn't do anything directly. It just supervises vendors. And when something breaks, no one's really accountable. Everyone's temporary. Everyone's expensive. And no one bleeds for the mission. What used to be a company is now a hollow shell with good branding. The same thing happens to governments. A nation can't staff its own hospitals or maintain its own roads or defend its borders. So it starts to rent those functions. Consultants, contractors, mercenaries. And at first they seem better than the locals. Faster, more experienced, less sentimental. But there's a hidden cost. Because people who aren't invested don't stay loyal. Throughout history, collapsing systems made the same mistake. They stopped trusting their own people, or didn't have enough, or didn't want to pay them. So they hired help. They hired fighters who didn't care about the flag, only the gold. They hired guards who weren't from the city they protected. They hired experts who didn't speak the language, didn't know the history, didn't feel the pain. And when things got hard, those mercenaries flipped, or walked away, or demanded more. Because why not? They owed you nothing. That's the gamble. You can rent skill, but you can't rent loyalty. And the more you rely on people who don't care, the more fragile your system becomes. You lose memory, commitment, culture, the kind of glue that can't be written into a contract. This doesn't just happen in empires. It happens in teams, in companies, in families, in yourself. How many things have you handed off, not because you couldn't do them, but because you didn't want to feel them? How many problems have you outsourced to someone else, hoping they'd care for you? That's the trap. You get used to detachment, and then one day you need someone to stand with you, not for money, not for a paycheck, just because it matters. And there's no one left, just hired help, waiting to be paid. The Palace Coup. It usually starts quietly, not with rebellion, not with a speech, but with a look, a delay, a decision that wasn't yours. Someone changes the calendar without asking. Someone else leaves your name off a group message. And suddenly, you're not sure who's really in charge anymore. A palace coup doesn't need a palace. It happens in offices, in startups, in families, in friend groups, anywhere power exists. Even a little. Someone's always watching it, measuring it, figuring out how to take it, not by force, but by presence. You've probably felt it, that shift when someone moves from helpful to controlling. When they stop asking you what you want and start deciding for you on your behalf. When the people around you start acting like the new center of gravity is somewhere else, it doesn't feel like betrayal. Not at first. It feels like delegation, like they're helping you out, taking something off your plate until the plate is empty. And you're not sure when it happened. I've seen it happen in startups. The founder builds something with passion. They bring on a COO, someone experienced, someone who knows how to scale. It works until one day the board sides with the operator. The founders pushed out of the company they created, not because they failed, but because they were in the way. No public fight, just a quiet vote, a new login, a closed door. In old kingdoms, this kind of shift ended in poison. In modern ones, it ends in passwords. What makes a palace coup so dangerous is that the person behind it doesn't look like a threat. They're helpful, trusted. They've been at your side. They know the system, the people, the weaknesses. They don't have to break in. They're already inside, and they don't need to lie. They just need to wait. Because when power is concentrated in one person, whether it's a king, a CEO, a parent, everyone else has two choices: obey or get clever. You don't have to be in politics to live this. You just need to have something others want: authority, attention, influence, trust. And if you're not actively guarding it, someone else is probably managing it for you until it's theirs. And the worst part, by the time you realize what's happened, everyone else already calls them the leader. The weak king's nightmare. Sometimes the person in charge doesn't want to lead. Not really. They like the title, the status, the idea of being respected. But when decisions have to be made, real ones, the kind that make enemies, they freeze. They hesitate. They delegate it away. And in the silence that follows, someone else fills the gap. That's where the real danger begins. Because power hates a vacuum. If the leader isn't leading, someone else is. The advisor, the spouse, the CFO, the head of strategy, the crowd, and the person at the top, still smiling, still giving speeches, but no longer steering the ship. I've seen this more times than I can count. A new manager gets promoted. They're smart, well-liked, but unsure. They avoid conflict. They want to be everyone's friend, so they stop pushing back. They start letting louder voices make the decisions, and soon the team is no longer theirs. They're a figurehead, a ceremonial leader. Their authority exists mostly in the org chart. And the worst part? Sometimes they don't even realize it. There's an old pattern in power. If the person at the top can't say no, someone else becomes the real. In monarchies, it played out with weak kings and powerful regents. The ruler wore the crown, but it was the advisor pulling strings. The general giving orders. The queen writing decrees. Outsiders saw a throne, but insiders knew better. And eventually, insiders get tired of pretending. Because when people start seeing the leader as a puppet, they stop respecting the position altogether. Every whisper becomes a challenge. Every delay, an opportunity. Power leaks. Morale drops. The vultures start circling. And if the leader finally does try to take charge, it's too late. No one listens. Everyone's already moved on. There's something quietly terrifying about being in charge, but not in control. You're held responsible, but you have no leverage. You carry the title, but someone else calls the shots. You sit at the head of the table and feel completely alone. That's the weak king's nightmare. And it doesn't take a throne to live it. It just takes silence when you should have spoken. Delay when you should have decided. Fear when you should have led. Because if you don't steer, someone else will grab the wheel. And once they've had a taste of direction, good luck getting it back. The frontier that swallowed empires. It always looks like opportunity. A new border, unclaimed land, untapped resources, a place to expand and a people to civilize, conquer, or control. Every empire has one. A place beyond the edge where they believe their power will grow stronger. And every empire eventually learns the same thing. Frontiers don't just stretch your power, they test it, then they break it. Because the further you push, the harder it becomes to hold. Supply lines thin, communications slow, local resistance builds, and the heart of the empire begins to forget why it went there in the first place. By the time anyone realizes how far it's gone, it's already too far. You see this pattern everywhere. A state grows strong in its center, cities, roads, armies, order. Then it pushes outward. At first, expansion feels easy. The first towns fall. The first trade routes open. The first victory celebrations echo. But the land keeps going. And the people beyond it don't always fold. They adapt. They fight smarter. They know the terrain better. And they're not defending an idea. They're defending home. Eventually, the empire sends more troops, more administrators, more money, and still the problems grow. Not because of enemies, but because the empire is now stretched beyond what it can manage. The people at the edge start to feel like they're part of a different world. Their loyalty fades. Their frustration grows. And when collapse comes, it usually starts from there. The edge, not the center. Because frontiers aren't just geography, they're tension points, cultural cracks, pressure zones. The further an empire expands, the more it has to become something else to maintain control. More brutal, more paranoid, more fragile. Eventually, it breaks. We don't just see this in ancient empires. You see it in modern institutions that scale too fast, in companies that expand without grounding, in leaders who take on more than they can hold, more teams, more projects, more responsibility, until the core starts to rot. Growth isn't strength if you can't support it. And sometimes, the greatest threat to a system isn't invasion. It's overextension, that slow drift into places it never should have gone, chasing a vision that never had a limit. The frontier always looks like a gift, but if you're not careful, it becomes the place where your strength disappears. The mob that rules the city. There's a moment when order disappears. It doesn't happen with a bang. It happens when everyone looks around and realizes no one's in charge anymore. And that's when the mob takes over. It doesn't matter what city, what era, what system of government. When fear spreads faster than authority, the crowd becomes its own leader. And once it starts moving, it doesn't need a plan. It just needs momentum. You've seen glimpses of it. A peaceful protest turns after one window breaks. A stadium full of fans shifts when someone throws a bottle. A group chat spirals when someone throws the first accusation. Crowds are powerful because they feel safe, not for individuals, but from them. Alone, you wouldn't flip a car. But if 200 people are running, shouting, charging, what's one more step? The psychology is simple. When the group acts, your brain turns down, judgment softens, blame dilutes, and anything feels possible, righteous or reckless. History is filled with mobs that changed everything. In the late Roman Republic, politicians hired gangs to disrupt each other's speeches. These weren't protesters, they were street enforcers. Senators couldn't speak without getting bricks thrown at them. Eventually, votes were held at sword point. Politics gave way to whoever had the bigger crowd. In revolutionary France, the National Assembly debated policy while mobs stormed bakeries, prisons, and palaces. Even those in power started fearing the people more than the enemy. They began to make decisions not from principle, but from survival. The pattern is always the same. When the crowd senses weakness, it becomes the system. Sometimes it's rage. Sometimes it's celebration. Sometimes it's confusion. But underneath all of it is this, a power vacuum where rules no longer apply. And once a crowd discovers it can get what it wants by force, it doesn't go back to asking politely. This isn't just about riots or revolutions. It's about the speed at which collective emotion spreads. Online mobs operate the same way. One tweet becomes thousands. One accusation becomes collapse. One narrative dominates before anyone can check the facts. The crowd doesn't wait. The crowd doesn't reflect. The crowd doesn't apologize. It moves, and that's the danger. Because while mobs sometimes bring justice, they're just as often driven by emotion, rumor, and rage. There's no leader to talk to, no logic to appeal to. And when the crowd gets it wrong, there's no one to take responsibility. So when systems start to shake, when power feels like it's up for grabs, when leaders look unsure, people stop waiting for permission. They fill the streets. They raise their voices. They act. And in that moment, it's not the government that rules the city. It's the mood. The trial of the thinker. He didn't carry a weapon. He didn't organize a rebellion. He wrote an essay. Antonio Gramsci was a writer and philosopher in early 20th century Italy. He questioned how power worked. Why people obeyed systems that harmed them. Why culture could be used not to free people, but to control them. And for that, The government sentenced him to 20 years in prison. The court record was blunt. One official said, "We must stop this brain from functioning." Not because his ideas were false, but because they were too clear. Gramsci didn't get arrested for conspiracy. He didn't promote violence. He was a writer. He was dangerous because he helped people understand how power manipulates thought, and that was enough to make him a target. This is a pattern you see again and again throughout history. When a system becomes fragile, the first thing it silences isn't protest, it's thinking, not loud thinking. Not angry speeches, just clear, honest questions. Because those questions spread. And if you want to hold power, the last thing you want is people rethinking everything they've been told, so the thinker becomes the threat. You don't need to look far for other examples. In Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge, simply wearing glasses was seen as a sign that you might be educated, and people were executed for it. In Iran, dissident poets were blacklisted and jailed for writing about grief and injustice. In Argentina's Dirty War, professors were abducted and disappeared for challenging the official version of events. The pattern is simple. When power feels insecure, it doesn't fear weapons, it fears words, especially words that help people see clearly. And the tragedy is, it often works. The thinkers get silenced. The public forgets the questions were even being asked. And systems continue, not because they're right, but because no one's allowed to explain why they're wrong. And even in free countries today, you still see a quiet version of this. Someone publishes an uncomfortable truth, and suddenly they lose funding. A professor questions a dominant narrative and gets removed from a panel. An expert gives a talk that makes people nervous, and no one invites them again. No one says it's punishment, but everyone gets the message. Don't be that person. And just like that, thinking gets outsourced. People stop asking, and power stays exactly where it is. The witch hunt. There's a special kind of fear that doesn't go after the powerful. It goes after the powerless. It doesn't demand justice. It demands a target. And once people are scared enough of change, of chaos, of things they can't explain, they start looking for someone to blame, someone close, someone different, someone safe to accuse. That's how a witch hunt begins. It's not really about witches. It never was. It's about fear looking for a face. It happens when people feel helpless, when the world seems out of control, when crops fail or money dries up, or rules collapse. Suddenly, the idea that someone, somewhere, is secretly causing all this, it feels comforting. Because if someone is to blame, then maybe we can fix it. Maybe we can punish it. Maybe the chaos isn't random. It's evil, and evil can be rooted out. That's the fantasy. But the reality is darker. In 17th century Europe, entire towns burned women alive for nothing more than being too old, too quiet, or too strange. In some cases, people were tortured until they named others, neighbors, friends, family. Fear spreads like fire when accusation becomes survival. You didn't have to be guilty. You just had to be next. We like to believe that's all ancient superstition, that we've outgrown it. But witch hunts didn't end. They just changed clothes. You've seen it. The online dogpile over a misinterpreted sentence. The coworker iced out over an unproven rumor. The teenager bullied because they acted different in the wrong hallway. It's always the same energy. We don't feel safe, so let's find someone to exile. The logic is circular. You're suspicious because someone said you're suspicious. You're guilty because you're trying too hard to prove you're not. The absence of evidence becomes part of the case. The more invisible your crime, the more dangerous it must be. And people don't even realize what they're participating in, because it feels righteous. It feels like justice, like protection, like moral clarity in a messy world. But look closer. The witch hunt is never about the target. It's about the crowd, about giving fear a script to follow, about turning paranoia into performance, because there's something addictive about pointing the finger, especially when everyone else is pointing too. And once the flames are high enough, no one dares ask questions. They just nod and throw another log on the fire. The Gunpowder Lesson. For thousands of years, power came from muscle. Kings ruled by armies of armored men. Castles were the ultimate defense, and warfare was slow, expensive, and elite. But then came gunpowder. It didn't just change how wars were fought. It changed who could fight them. Before gunpowder, an elite knight was trained from childhood. They wore armor so thick it could stop swords, arrows, even most spears. To take down a knight, you needed skill, strategy, or sheer numbers. But with a musket, you didn't need skill. You didn't need years of training. You just needed a steady hand and a trigger. Suddenly, peasants with cheap firearms could kill nobles in full armor. Fortresses that had stood for centuries crumbled under cannon fire, and the entire structure of warfare and power had to change. This is the gunpowder lesson. When a new weapon appears, it doesn't just add power, it redistributes it. It makes old systems obsolete. And those in power, they usually don't see it coming. The samurai in Japan resisted firearms for centuries. They believed the sword was noble, and guns were cowardly. But when Western armies arrived with cannons and rifles, the old code cracked. Honor didn't matter when you were outgunned. In Europe, noble families who built their empires on swordsmanship were suddenly vulnerable to anyone with black powder. Gunpowder leveled the playing field, and that terrified the elite. But here's where it gets darker. Every time a new weapon redistributes power, it doesn't stay equal for long. Eventually, the new weapon gets monopolized, mass-produced, scaled, controlled by whoever has the most resources. The musket that once gave the common soldier power eventually became part of an industrial war machine, and by the 20th century, weapons had escalated into bombs, enough to kill millions with a single drop. And now? The gunpowder of today isn't explosive, it's digital. Cyber weapons, drones, AI-powered surveillance, cheap to use, hard to trace, capable of reshaping the balance of power once again. But the cycle repeats. At first, it's liberating. Then it becomes centralized. Then it becomes terrifying. The gunpowder lesson isn't about guns, it's about disruption. Every time a new weapon emerges, it threatens the old rulers. And for a moment, things feel equal again. But then someone builds a bigger one, and the rest are left playing catch-up or becoming collateral. The Scapegoat Ritual. Sometimes the system doesn't fix the problem, it just finds someone to absorb it. Not because they're guilty, not because it solves anything, but because people need closure. They need a sense that someone paid the price. So they create a scapegoat. It's older than religion, older than law, older than written language. In ancient rituals, people would take an animal, usually a goat, and symbolically place all their community's sins onto it. Then they'd drive it into the wilderness, or kill it, and afterwards, they'd feel lighter, cleansed, safe again. The ritual didn't remove the source of the suffering, it just gave the pain a target. That basic structure still runs under our society like a hidden current. Think about how often we see someone fired to send a message, a single employee blamed for a systemic failure, a mid-level executive blamed for decisions made far above their pay grade, a student suspended to preserve an institution's reputation, a celebrity destroyed to make an example. Sometimes the person did mess up. But what matters in the scapegoat ritual isn't proportion, it's sacrifice. The public needs to see someone fall. And once that someone is chosen, the outcome is rarely in doubt. What makes this so dangerous is how relieving it feels. A scandal breaks, emotions rise, and people want resolution, not a complex analysis, not a deep investigation. They want a name, a punishment, a purge. And once they get it, the tension disappears. The story closes, but the cycle remains. Because the system never changed, only the scapegoat did. You'll see it everywhere once you know what to look for. A failing business blames the lowest performer. A nation suffering under corruption blames a minority group. A political party loses an election and blames its own internal faction. A friend group turns on the weird one after months of unspoken tension. In each case, there's relief, a pressure valve opening, a story wrapped in a neat, cruel bow. But here's the part most people miss. The scapegoat was never the real problem. They were the placeholder, the decoy, the emotional sponge for everything people didn't want to face directly. And once the ritual is over, people go back to normal until the next crisis. Then the cycle starts again. The truth is, if you need someone to be sacrificed in order to feel whole, you're not actually healing. You're outsourcing the pain. And one day, if you're not careful, you'll be the one holding the blame that doesn't belong to you. The Festival of Blood. There's a point where violence stops being shocking, where punishment stops being private, and cruelty becomes celebration. Not hidden, not ashamed, but public, loud, applauded. And that's when something terrifying happens. The system no longer just tolerates violence, it performs it. There's a name for it: spectacle punishment. It's what happens when a society starts putting its darkest instincts on display, not to scare people, but to entertain them. You've seen the images: the Roman Colosseum, crowds roaring as men are torn apart for sport. Criminals executed not in shadows, but in arenas, blood spilled as proof that the state is strong, that justice is visible, that fear is order. But this isn't ancient history. The instincts didn't die, they just changed medium. In early modern Europe, public executions were planned like festivals. Merchants sold food. Children were brought to watch. Heads were displayed on spikes to remind the people what happens when you step out of line. It wasn't just punishment, it was a message, a ritual, a moment of unity built on death, and beneath all of it was something darker: relief. Because if someone else is being punished publicly, it means the mob is safe. For now. We don't do public executions anymore, at least not in the square. But the instinct didn't vanish. It just digitized. You've seen it online. A person makes a mistake, sometimes minor, sometimes real. A video goes viral. Comment sections swell with rage. People demand consequences. Sponsors drop. Friends vanish. Everyone joins in. Not just to correct, but to watch it burn. You can almost hear the chant: they deserve it. They asked for it. They should have known better. And the spectacle begins. It doesn't matter if the punishment fits. What matters is that it feels good, that it satisfies some ancient hunger to see power swing its blade. And just like the Colosseum, the audience tells themselves they're not responsible, they're just watching, just following along, just clicking, sharing, liking, reacting. But what makes it worse now is the speed. It used to take days to build a scaffold. Now one tweet can build a digital execution stage in under an hour. Here's the real danger. When punishment becomes entertainment, justice becomes performance. And when cruelty starts to feel fun, no one stops to ask whether it's right. They just wait for the next show. The gold fever. It always starts the same way. Someone finds something shiny, or valuable, or rare. Gold in the river, rubber in the jungle, oil in the ground, lithium in the desert. And almost overnight, the world changes. People flood in. Governments make promises. Investors circle. Prices skyrocket. And the one resource, the one product, the one mineral, becomes the only thing that matters. This is the pattern of a resource rush. And it's one of the most destructive forces in human history, because what looks like sudden wealth always comes at a cost. Take the California gold rush in 1849. Hundreds of thousands of people swarmed into what had been sparsely populated land. Towns exploded into existence. Boom towns rose, and most collapsed just as fast. Law disappeared. Vigilantism ruled. and the indigenous populations caught between greed and guns were slaughtered or displaced. It was a short-term bonanza, followed by long-term ruin. The land was stripped, rivers poisoned, forests cut, and within a few decades, the gold was gone. But the damage stayed. Or take Congo, where rubber and later cobalt became global obsessions. Under King Leopold of Belgium, rubber quotas were enforced with amputation and murder. Villages were burned for failing to produce enough. Millions died in service of bicycle tires and telegram wires. Today, Congo still bleeds, not for rubber, but for cobalt. The same story, new tech. Children dig in toxic pits to mine the metal inside your smartphone battery, and no one talks about it, because the supply chain is hidden just far enough away. This is the gold fever. It's not about gold, it's about the way humans respond to scarcity that promises power. The Amazon burns not for gold, but for soy and cattle. Oceans are scraped clean, not for gold, but for tuna and shrimp. Entire countries have overthrown governments to secure oil, diamonds, or access to ports. The logic is always the same. If we can just get more of that thing, we win. But what happens is something darker. When a single resource becomes the center of an economy, everything else withers, farming declines, education collapses, democracy becomes a joke, infrastructure rots. This is called the resource curse. The countries with the most natural wealth often end up the poorest, most corrupt, most violent, because power concentrates around control, not growth. Gold doesn't feed a nation. Oil doesn't educate a child. Cobalt doesn't build a future. They just attract whoever's willing to take the most by force. The great lie of resource rushes is that they create prosperity. They don't. They create addiction. Short-term gain, long-term decay. A society obsessed with extracting wealth eventually forgets how to build it. The language of lies. When the war in Vietnam escalated, the U.S. government started calling dead civilians collateral damage. Not victims. Not people. Just a technical consequence. It's easier that way. You don't have to face what you're doing if you change the words. Governments learned this a long time ago. Control the language, and you control what people can even think. During the Soviet Union's reign, grain shortages became temporary distribution challenges. Mass arrests were protective custody. Executions were corrective measures. It wasn't just spin, it was a weapon. And the goal wasn't to fool people completely. It was to make them uncertain. To muddy the truth just enough that people stopped asking questions. When words lose their meaning, action loses its urgency. If it's not torture, just enhanced interrogation, then maybe it's acceptable. If it's not spying on citizens, just metadata collection, maybe it's fine. If it's not lying, just misinformation, then maybe no one's really at fault. And it doesn't stop with governments. Corporations do it too. Oil companies don't cause ecological disasters. They experience unplanned releases. Mass layoffs become streamlining. Toxic waste isn't dumped, it's reallocated. This language infects the way people talk, and eventually, the way they think. War becomes strategy. Censorship becomes safety. Corruption becomes lobbying. Truth becomes optional. And when the language becomes flexible enough, even atrocities can be narrated in a neutral tone. It's not that people are stupid, it's that people are overloaded. Most don't have the time or energy to decode every euphemism, double meaning, or bureaucratic trick. And the more you normalize vague, bloodless language, the harder it becomes to get people to recognize something's wrong. This is how systems maintain themselves without violence. They don't just suppress dissent, they make it harder to name what's happening. And if you can't name it, you can't fight it. The fear that silences nations. They didn't need chains. They didn't need guns. All it took was a knock at the door. Once. After that, no one spoke. In Stalin's Soviet Union, people learned quickly what silence could save you from. A neighbor disappeared. A coworker was denounced. A family member said the wrong thing in the wrong room and never came home. And you stayed quiet. You didn't ask where they went. You didn't comfort the grieving. You kept your head down even if your heart screamed, not because you agreed, but because you wanted to stay alive. The greatest weapon wasn't the secret police. It was the silence they created around them. At first, people told themselves it was temporary, a precaution that they'd speak up once it was safe. But the silence grew thicker. Meetings ended early. Eyes avoided contact. Words shrank. Children were taught to report their parents. People didn't just stop resisting. They stopped remembering what it felt like to speak freely. And here's the part that really breaks you. Most of them weren't cowards. They were survivors. We tend to imagine censorship as something external, a law, a ban, a punishment. But when fear is strong enough, people begin censoring themselves. Not once, not twice, but constantly, reflexively, until silence becomes part of the culture. Until no one has to tell you what you can't say. You already know. You might think that only happens under dictatorships, that this kind of fear is foreign, extreme, historical. But it's not. Look around, and you'll see its traces everywhere. In workplaces where everyone agrees publicly but rolls their eyes privately. In classrooms where students avoid topics that might get them labeled. In friendships that survive only because certain truths are never spoken aloud. People don't say what they think. Not because they've changed their minds, but because they've learned what disagreement costs. And over time, the line between what I believe and what I'm allowed to say begins to blur. Until eventually, a whole society starts speaking in code. Fear doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers. It teaches you to smile, to nod, to play along. And if it's done well enough, no one even notices they're still afraid. The history that gets rewritten. In school, you probably learned that Christopher Columbus discovered America in 1492. He didn't. He never set foot on what's now the United States. He thought he'd landed in Asia, and when he encountered the people already living there, he enslaved them, mutilated them, and helped launch centuries of genocide. But for generations, the story was different. It was heroic. It was clean. It was a myth written not by truth, but by power. This is how history actually works. It's not just what happened, it's what someone with authority says happened, and what they decide to leave out. When the British Empire wrote about its global expansion, it wasn't called conquest, it was called civilization. They weren't stealing resources, they were bringing enlightenment. They didn't destroy cultures, they developed them. When the Civil War ended in the U.S., textbooks in the South described slavery as a peculiar institution that wasn't so bad. They portrayed the Confederacy as noble. For decades, statues went up, not to remember the truth, but to rewrite it. And even now, when schools teach about the atomic bomb, the story is often one of necessity. End the war. Save lives. What's often left out is that Japan was already close to surrender, and many scientists and generals opposed the bomb. But the official narrative had already been written. Here's the disturbing truth. Most people believe the version of history they were first taught, even if it's been disproven. Because once a story hardens into memory, it's hard to unlearn. Especially when it's wrapped in patriotism, identity, or family tradition. And the rewriting doesn't stop after the fact. Modern governments do it in real time. Photos get cropped, quotes get edited, speeches get retranslated. Sometimes it's subtle. Sometimes entire pages disappear. Textbooks change every few years, and you almost never notice because history isn't a record. It's a battleground, and if you control the past, you influence the present. A country can justify new wars by pointing to carefully curated old ones. A government can dismiss protest by saying, "We've made progress." A leader can silence critics by invoking a past that never really happened. You're not just taught history to remember, you're taught it to obey. And unless you dig, unless you ask who benefits from this version, You'll keep repeating a story that was never yours to begin with. The madness of crowds. They thought the market was cursed. It was London, 1720. A mob had gathered in the street, watching in disbelief as share prices collapsed in real time. Some wept. Others screamed. A few tried to sell their furniture, their jewelry, anything, just to recover what they had lost. The bubble had burst. The South Sea Company, once hailed as a miracle of modern finance, was now worthless. But the real story wasn't about stocks. It was about the crowd and how easily it had lost its mind. Just months before, people had lined up to invest. Bakers, barbers, bishops, they all poured in. No one understood what the company did. It didn't matter. Their friends were getting rich. The newspapers were euphoric. The excitement was contagious. And if you hesitated, you were mocked, left behind, told you were being too negative, too slow, too old-fashioned. So people rushed in and then rushed out, crushed by the very thing they had celebrated. That's the madness of crowds. Not violence, not rage, just momentum, without memory. And it happens far more often than we'd like to admit. The crowd doesn't think, it feels. It doesn't remember history, it mirrors itself. It doesn't ask, is this true? It asks, do enough people already believe it? Crowds are powerful because they remove the burden of individual thought. If everyone around you is certain, confident, energized, your doubt starts to feel like a flaw. And so you join in. You share the opinion. You repeat the slogan. You follow the trend. Not because you believe, but because you don't want to be the only one who doesn't. That's how crowds become movements. Movements become dogma, and dogma becomes disaster. You've seen it happen. Online communities convinced they've uncovered the truth, only to collapse into infighting and conspiracies. Consumer fads that grow so fast they devour entire industries and vanish a year later. Political waves that promise salvation until they turn and eat their own. In each case, it starts with a glow, unity, purpose, energy. But then something shifts. The certainty hardens. The voices get louder. The questions disappear. And suddenly, if you stop clapping, you become the enemy. The scariest part of a crowd isn't its noise. It's how comfortable it feels right before the fall. The Telegraph Illusion. In the mid-1800s, something strange happened. For the first time in human history, information could move faster than a horse. Before the telegraph, a message from New York to London would take weeks, traveling by ship across a stormy ocean. Leaders made decisions slowly. They had time to reflect, to wait for news, to think. Then came the telegraph. Suddenly, you could send a sentence across continents in minutes. The world shrank. Investors on Wall Street could react to wheat prices in India. Diplomats could negotiate in real time. Journalists could transmit the details of a war before the smoke had cleared. It was the internet of its day, hailed as the great unifier of nations. But something odd happened. Instead of making people smarter, it made them faster. And speed, without reflection, doesn't produce wisdom. It produces panic. In 1857, the world economy collapsed, in part because of real-time information. The telegraph allowed market rumors to spread instantly. Traders responded not to facts, but to fear. Banks fell like dominoes. A financial crisis swept across the US and Europe before many people even understood what was happening. It was one of the first information-driven crashes in history. And it wouldn't be the last. See, the assumption was simple. If we could communicate faster, we could make better decisions. But human brains don't scale that way. We didn't evolve to process global inputs in real time. We evolved to survive in small tribes, react to immediate threats, and make judgments with limited information. So when the inputs explode, when you're flooded with signals from 1,000 places at once, you don't become wise, you become reactive. You oversimplify. You jump to conclusions. You confuse speed for urgency and volume for truth. And the telegraph was just the beginning. Radio, television, cable news, social media, each wave of communication made the world faster. And each time, the illusion returned. If we just hear everything instantly, we'll understand better. But it never works that way. The 24-hour news cycle doesn't make you informed. It makes you anxious. The ability to respond to messages immediately doesn't make conversations deeper. It makes them shorter, angrier, louder. And today, we're drowning in this illusion. We think we're more aware than ever, but most of what we consume is just signal noise, headlines, tweets, notifications, outrage. We don't think, we react. That's the dark lesson. The tools we built to connect us often end up controlling us. Because communication isn't wisdom, speed isn't depth, and reaction isn't reason. The leaders of the 19th century thought the telegraph would end war. If people could talk, they said, they wouldn't fight. But World War I was planned over telegraph lines, coordinated in real time, executed with terrifying precision. More communication didn't mean more peace, it just meant faster destruction. So here we are, with fiber optics, satellites, 5G, and instant messaging. More connected than any humans in history. But are we wiser? More reflective? More united? Or are we just more reactive, more overwhelmed, more caught in the illusion that knowing fast is the same as knowing well? It never was. And unless we slow down, unless we learn to disconnect, to reflect, to think, we'll keep mistaking the noise for the truth. And history will repeat, not because we didn't know, but because we knew too fast, too shallow, and too loud. The riot that became revolution. It started with bread. Not a speech, not a plan, just the price of bread doubling and no explanation. The year was 1789. Paris was restless, hungry. People waited in line for hours just to buy a loaf. Some days, there was no bread at all. The bakeries ran out, the shopkeepers were afraid, and then someone shouted, "They're hoarding it, the rich are hiding food." That was all it took. A crowd formed, then another and another. They didn't have weapons, just anger. They marched, first to the city hall, then to the palace. Some were barefoot, many were women. They didn't come for politics, they came for answers. That march became a riot. That riot became a movement. And that movement cracked the bones of a kingdom. You know the rest, the guillotine, the revolution, the rewriting of Europe. But it didn't start with ideals. It started with desperation. That's what people forget. Revolutions don't begin with manifestos. They begin when the normal things stop working, when prices rise and wages don't, when leaders smile and citizens suffer, when the gap between the powerful and the powerless becomes too wide to ignore. And then something small happens. A spark, a tax hike, a police beating, a sudden shortage, and people pour into the streets, not because they want chaos, but because chaos already arrived, quietly, long ago. We often judge history in hindsight. We think we would have seen it coming, that we'd know the moment when things were about to break. But revolutions never look like revolutions at first. They look like noise, like vandalism, like those people being unreasonable again. Until it spreads, and suddenly what seemed fringe becomes the center. The crowd grows. The police falter. The symbols fall. And those in power realize, far too late, that it wasn't just a riot. It was a verdict. This doesn't just happen in nations. It happens in companies, schools, communities. Anywhere people are asked to stay quiet while something rots, they stay quiet until they don't. And once the flood starts, it doesn't go back into the river. So when you see unrest, don't just ask what people are doing. Ask why they waited so long to do it, because by the time the windows break, the real damage was already done. The tool that became a weapon. It's easy to forget, but dynamite was invented by a man who wanted to stop violence. Alfred Nobel thought if he could create a safer explosive, something more stable than nitroglycerin, it could be used to build tunnels, roads, railways. It would help connect the world. It would save lives. Instead, it revolutionized warfare. More powerful explosives, more efficient killing, nations racing to stockpile destruction. Nobel was so disturbed by how his invention was used that he rewrote his legacy, founding the Nobel Peace Prize in an attempt to balance the scales. But it was too late. The tool had become a weapon, and it wouldn't be the last time. The same story played out again with Fritz Haber, the chemist who helped pull nitrogen from the air to make fertilizer. It was one of the most important discoveries in human history. Without it, billions would starve. But during World War I, he used the same chemistry to develop poison gas. He even watched its first use on the battlefield. His invention could feed the world or choke it. This is the pattern. We build something to help, and it gets weaponized. We invent to connect, and it gets used to control. The internet was supposed to be a democratic revolution. Now it's a tool for surveillance, propaganda, and psychological warfare. AI was built to automate boring work. Now it's being trained to design weapons, exploit attention, and deepfake reality. Every tool has a dual nature, and the darker purpose usually pays better. It's not that invention is evil, it's that humans don't control what we make. Once it starts being useful to power, because weapons are profitable, violence scales. And once something can be used to dominate, someone will. History shows it's not the original purpose that matters, it's who picks it up next. The silence that meant agreement. No one said yes, but no one said no either. That's how it started. Someone proposed a rule, not a big one, just a new policy, a change in how things were done, a tightening, a filtering, a quiet shift. Everyone in the room paused. Some looked unsure. One or two glanced at each other. But no one spoke up, so it passed. And from that point on, silence became the signal. If you didn't push back, you were on board. If you didn't protest, you agreed. If you didn't resist even a little, then you had chosen your side, not because you believed, but because you didn't say otherwise. That's how systems change, not always through force. Sometimes they change by getting people to do nothing, just long enough for momentum to take over. You've seen it, a bad idea gaining support in a meeting because no one wants to be the first to object. A joke that crosses the line and everyone laughs just to keep the mood light. A plan that feels off. But speaking up would mean drawing attention, or worse, becoming a target. So you stay quiet. Not forever. Just this once. Then again. And slowly, the silence grows louder than any protest ever could. In Nazi Germany, entire neighborhoods watched their Jewish neighbors be taken away. Not because they agreed. Not because they hated. But because the moment to speak had passed, and now speaking meant risk. So they looked away. They convinced themselves it wasn't their place. They weren't the killers. They were the quiet. But the truth is, silence moves history just as much as action does. It gives cover. It gives permission. It tells the powerful, you may continue. Not saying something doesn't make you neutral. It makes you useful to someone. And once that usefulness is noticed, it's exploited. Because systems built on fear don't just punish dissent. They reward silence. They create environments where speaking is costly, but staying quiet feels polite, practical, professional, wise. Until one day you look around and realize, no one's saying anything anymore. And the silence, now it means something. The road that led to collapse. In the ruins of ancient Rome, you can still walk on roads that were built over 2,000 years ago, perfectly straight, engineered to last, stretching across an empire that believed it could never fall. But it did. Not all at once, not in a blaze of glory, but through slow, grinding decay. Rome didn't collapse because it ran out of ambition. It collapsed because it built too much. Aqueducts, walls, temples, theaters, roads, outposts, colonies, all magnificent. But every mile of road had to be patrolled. Every fort needed soldiers, every city needed grain, and every system needed upkeep. The empire became a machine that was too expensive to maintain. So when the economy faltered, or the climate shifted, or enemies pressed at the borders, they couldn't adapt. Because all their resources were locked in infrastructure they could no longer afford. This isn't just ancient history. The Soviet Union spent decades building massive apartment blocks, missile silos, space programs, secret cities, only to find it couldn't feed its own people or keep the lights on. Detroit, once the proud symbol of American industry, built vast networks of factories, highways, and suburbs. And when the auto industry declined, what was left was a hollowed-out shell, too big to shrink, too broken to fix. We still fall for this. We think building more means progress. We expand cities endlessly, with roads, airports, malls, fiber cables. But what we rarely ask is, can we maintain it? It's easy to fund a new highway. It's harder to fill its potholes for 50 years. It's easy to build a giant hospital. It's harder to staff it with skilled workers long term. It's easy to launch a massive tech platform. It's harder to patch its vulnerabilities, moderate its content, protect its users forever. The hidden cost of infrastructure isn't just money. It's commitment. And every time we build something permanent without thinking about maintenance, we're borrowing against the future, not just financially, but structurally. Because when decay starts, it moves fast. A water system breaks down, and diseases come back. A bridge collapses, and cities grind to a halt. A power grid ages, and blackouts ripple like dominoes. We think collapse looks like fire and chaos. But most of the time, it looks like neglect. An empire isn't lost because of what it failed to build. It's lost because of what it couldn't keep running. The religious fire, movements burning brighter than reason. People don't need facts to feel certain. They need a belief that explains the world, gives them purpose, and tells them who's good and who's evil. And once that belief locks in, it becomes hard to challenge, even with evidence, even with logic, because now, it's not just a belief, it's their identity. That's where the danger begins. When someone builds their sense of self around a sacred idea, any disagreement feels personal. A question isn't just curiosity. It feels like an attack. A counterpoint sounds like betrayal. And so they react defensively, then aggressively, then violently. You've seen this happen, not just in religion, but in any group with a rigid worldview. Political movements, social causes, online communities, even corporate cultures. When people believe they're holding the ultimate truth, they start to treat doubt as a threat. They stop asking questions, and they start policing others who do. That's how people get pushed out, silenced, labeled as dangerous, not for what they did, but for what they questioned. History is full of this. The church silenced Galileo because he challenged the Earth-centered model. Scientists were jailed or killed for going against state ideology. People have been exiled, tortured, executed, not because they were wrong, but because they refused to stop thinking. And every time, the people in power justified it by saying they were protecting truth. But they weren't protecting truth. They were protecting control, because once a belief becomes too sacred to question, it stops being about truth at all. It becomes about loyalty, and that's when reason disappears. You don't need to go back centuries to see it. You can see it in places where disagreement is treated like betrayal, where people walk on eggshells around certain topics, where asking the wrong question gets you labeled, attacked, or removed. It doesn't matter if the belief is political, spiritual, scientific, or cultural. If it can't tolerate scrutiny, it's not strong, it's brittle. Truth doesn't fear questions, but belief systems that rely on fear always do. The profit problem. Why new truths are first branded heresy. People think truth spreads because it's obvious that once someone reveals something real about science, society, or the human condition, the world listens, nods, and moves forward. But that's not how it works. The truth, when it first shows up, usually sounds crazy. It challenges whatever people already believe. It forces them to rethink what they thought was settled. And most people don't like that. So the first person to speak the truth often gets attacked, not because they're wrong, but because they're early. This is the core of the prophet problem. The messenger gets punished before the message is even understood. History is full of examples. Socrates was executed for corrupting the youth, but all he did was ask questions no one wanted to answer. Galileo was put on trial for claiming the earth moves, something we now teach in elementary school. Even people like Darwin or Freud were ridiculed and hated in their own time, not because they lacked evidence, but because their ideas made people uncomfortable. But this isn't just about historical figures. It happens anytime someone presents a truth that doesn't fit the current system, political, religious, academic, or cultural. If you're the first one to challenge a harmful norm, you often won't be praised for your insight. You'll be seen as a threat, not just by those in power, but by ordinary people who feel personally invested in the current worldview. Because if your idea is right, that means they've been wrong, and that's not easy to accept. So instead of debating the idea, people attack the person. They question your credibility. They call you extreme. They accuse you of dangerous intentions. The goal isn't to disprove your idea. It's to disqualify you as someone worth listening to. This is why the truth often needs time to survive. It needs more voices, more evidence, more distance from the first person who said it. By the time society is ready to accept the idea, the original messenger is often long gone or long forgotten. And ironically, once the idea becomes popular, everyone claims they supported it all along. So no, truth doesn't win by being obvious. It wins by surviving long enough for people to stop feeling threatened by it. The book that was banned. Some books were never meant to be read, not because they were dangerous to the public, but because they were dangerous to power. When a regime wants control, it doesn't just ban weapons, it bans words. And the more fragile the system becomes, the more books go missing. This has happened in every era, under every ideology, religious, political, secular, even scientific. All it takes is one idea that doesn't fit, and suddenly it's labeled corrupt, unpatriotic, blasphemous, subversive. And it doesn't matter if the idea is true. The goal of censorship has never been to protect people. It's to protect authority from having to answer to reality. Sometimes they burn the books. Sometimes they just stop printing them. Sometimes they let them exist, but make it dangerous to quote them. The method changes. The pattern doesn't. In Nazi Germany, entire libraries were emptied. In the Soviet Union, books were rewritten or vanished completely. In religious empires, forbidden texts were buried or hidden or blamed for plagues. Even philosophers and scientists had their works locked away, banned from schools, or edited to remove what was unacceptable. Entire centuries of knowledge were stalled, not because of lack of insight, but because the insight came too soon or aimed too high. And when the bans didn't work, new tools were added. Label the author immoral, attack their character, claim the words are fake, dangerous, unverified. Censorship doesn't always use fire. Sometimes it uses bureaucracy. Sometimes it uses social pressure. Sometimes it just makes people too afraid to admit they've read it. What makes this darker is how well it works. People forget books existed. They forget the questions ever had answers. Eventually, they stop asking altogether. And even when the bans lift, even when the books return, the damage stays. The conversations that were never had, the generations that were never taught, the ideas that arrived decades late. We like to think information is free now, that we've outgrown this. But look at how quickly things disappear when they become inconvenient. Search results vanish. Accounts are suspended. Publishers back away. Articles get memory hold, not by order, but by silence. The banned book doesn't always sit on a blacklist. Sometimes it just quietly stops showing up. And that's all it takes for truth to disappear again, not because it was wrong, but because someone powerful didn't want to hear it. The knowledge that was lost. In the 1st century BCE, builders in ancient Rome created a kind of concrete that could harden underwater. They used it to construct harbors, docks, seawalls, structures that lasted for 2,000 years. Some are still standing today, stronger than anything modern concrete could survive. Then the empire fell, and the recipe disappeared. For centuries, nobody knew how they made it. Modern researchers have only recently begun to reverse engineer it, and even now we don't fully understand it. This wasn't just a clever trick. It was a technology that entire civilizations would have killed to have, and it was simply lost. Not because of disaster, not because of war, but because the people who knew how to make it stopped being listened to. As the empire declined, skilled laborers disappeared. Funding went elsewhere. Cultural priorities changed. The builders weren't replaced. The knowledge stopped being passed down, and no one noticed until it was too late. This isn't a rare case. In ancient India, craftsmen developed a kind of high-carbon steel known as woods, incredibly strong and flexible. It became the basis for Damascus steel, used in some of the finest swords in history. Today, the exact technique is lost. No one knows how to recreate it with the same consistency. The ancient Greeks built a mechanical computer, the Antikythera mechanism, capable of predicting eclipses, planetary motion, and calendar cycles. It was made over 2,000 years ago, and nothing like it would appear again for over a millennium. No one wrote it down. Or if they did, those texts didn't survive the fires, the invasions, the silences. We tend to think history is a steady climb, progress stacking on progress, but it's not. It's fragile. And when knowledge isn't protected, passed on, or respected, it vanishes. People assume lost knowledge only happens in ancient times. But look around. Government agencies delete data sets. Tech companies kill platforms and bury research. Engineers retire with systems no one else understands. Cultural practices are forgotten because no one thought they were important to record. Knowledge doesn't have to be banned to disappear. It just needs to be ignored. And when it's gone, you don't always know what you lost until something breaks, and you realize no one remembers how to fix it. The map that lied. In 1845, 2 ships left England to chart the final stretch of the Northwest Passage, a treacherous Arctic sea route connecting the Atlantic and Pacific. The expedition was led by Sir John Franklin. He had 129 men, well-stocked ships, and confidence. But there was a problem. Their maps were wrong. The charts they carried showed a navigable route. Smooth passages, ice-free zones, vague coastlines filled in with guesses. But the reality was different. There were ice-locked straits, dead ends, harsh terrain no ship could pass. The Franklin expedition vanished. Years later, rescuers would find traces, frozen bodies, abandoned camps, scattered notes. The ships had become trapped in pack ice. Dozens died from exposure, starvation, and lead poisoning. It was one of the greatest disasters in Arctic exploration, and at its heart was a simple tragedy. They trusted the map more than they trusted what they saw. And that is a pattern that repeats far beyond geography. Maps aren't just paper. They're any system that tells you what's out there, whether it's literal terrain, historical narratives, economic models, or even your own beliefs. The danger isn't the map being incomplete. It's when we treat it as complete. In the 2008 financial crisis, banks modeled risk using mathematical maps of the market. They believed housing prices couldn't all fall at once. They believed the models were right and reality was wrong. Entire economies crashed because the map was elegant, but false. In medicine, diagnostic models sometimes miss rare symptoms because they don't fit. Patients suffer because the map of the disease says that's not how it works. And in history, entire nations have acted based on maps that never existed, fake intelligence, misread treaties, edited textbooks. The Iraq War was launched partly because maps of the threat were manufactured, weapons of mass destruction that didn't exist. By the time the truth came out, hundreds of thousands were dead. Maps create authority. They're trusted. And that trust is dangerous when the map becomes more real than reality itself. But here's the deeper problem. We want maps. We want certainty. We want models that reduce chaos. We'd rather follow a flawed diagram than admit we're walking blind. And systems know this, so they give us confident-sounding charts, corporate roadmaps, political manifestos, historical timelines, and they say, follow this. It's accurate, even when it's not. The lesson here isn't that maps are useless, it's that they're always political. Someone decides what to include. Someone decides what to leave out. And if you don't ask who made this and what were they trying to show, then you're not navigating the world. You're just walking into a trap that someone else drew for you. The myth of progress, believing tomorrow will always be better. It's one of the most comforting lies we've ever told ourselves, that things are always getting better. More food, better medicine, faster technology, longer lives. Just look around. We have smartphones, space telescopes, AI. Surely we must be heading in the right direction. But here's the problem. Progress isn't guaranteed. It's not automatic. It's not linear, and it's not even always real. Sometimes it just feels like progress until you look closely. Start with medicine. We live longer, but chronic illness has exploded. People survive, but they don't thrive. Anxiety, depression, obesity, these didn't vanish with modern science. In many cases, they multiplied. Look at food. There's more of it than ever. And yet, entire nations are starving while others drown in waste. We engineered crops to grow faster, cheaper, and everywhere, but in doing so, we stripped the soil, poisoned water, and destroyed biodiversity. What about technology? We connected the world in seconds, but did we make it wiser? Social media spreads misinformation faster than truth. Attention spans collapse. Loneliness rises, and somehow, in a world more connected than ever, people feel more alone. Even war changed. It used to be fought on fields. Now it's fought through screens, through drones, deepfakes, data leaks. Progress didn't end violence. It just made it cleaner, quieter, harder to see. This is the myth of progress, that every step forward is a step up, that newer means better, that we can't go backward. But history says otherwise. The Roman Empire had plumbing, concrete, heating, even newspapers. When it fell, Europe lost those things for 1,000 years. Entire cities, with libraries, hospitals, astronomy, vanished. Knowledge had to be rediscovered, and no one even remembered what was lost until centuries later. Even today, ask yourself, if the power went out tomorrow and never came back, how much of your life could you rebuild? Could you grow food? Purify water? Make tools? For most people, the answer is no, because the complexity of our world feels like progress, but it's often just fragility disguised as advancement. We've built a world that works brilliantly until it doesn't. One global chip shortage, and everything from cars to ventilators stalls. One tanker stuck in a canal, and the global economy hiccups. One virus, and entire systems collapse. Progress, real progress, isn't about speed or scale. It's about resilience, depth, understanding. But those things aren't flashy. They don't go viral. And so, they get ignored. We celebrate the next big thing, forgetting that the last next big thing often created the current big problem. Nuclear power promised clean energy. Now we have waste that stays deadly for 10,000 years. Plastic solved storage. Now it's in our bloodstreams and oceans. Antibiotics saved millions. Now we face superbugs we can't kill. That's not to say progress is bad. It's to say that unchecked progress is blind. When we assume that tomorrow will automatically improve on today, we stop questioning, stop testing, stop preparing. We forget that improvement takes effort, that better ideas can still produce worse outcomes, and that sometimes what looks like a staircase is actually a treadmill, just faster, not higher. The myth of progress comforts us, but it also blinds us. Because if we truly believe things must always improve, we'll never see the edge until we fall off it. The technology trap. Imagine this. You wake up tomorrow and your phone doesn't work. No calls, no texts, no maps, no alarms. You try your laptop. Nothing. You walk outside. No traffic lights, no ATMs, no running trains. At first it feels surreal, but then it hits you. You're not just inconvenienced. You're helpless because you didn't just use technology. You relied on it. And when it disappears, so does your power. This is the technology trap. Not just using tools, but depending on them so completely that when they break, you break too. It's not a modern story. It's an old one. The Roman aqueducts were an engineering marvel. Cities were built around them. But when they collapsed, when they were sabotaged or abandoned, entire populations fled. Cities died because the system died. They couldn't go back to fetching water from rivers. They had forgotten how. The Maya built massive cities with sophisticated calendars, writing, and irrigation. But when drought hit, when one piece of their system failed, the entire civilization unraveled, not because they weren't smart, but because they were interdependent. They had climbed so high, so fast, that they couldn't survive without the ladder beneath them. And now, we're higher than ever. Electricity, the internet, global supply chains, cloud storage, satellites. We've built a world so interconnected, so smooth, so optimized, that we barely notice how much we lean on it until something goes wrong. A solar flare, a cyber attack, a pandemic, a chip shortage, and suddenly everything jams. Not just luxuries, but food, water, medicine, transportation. The more advanced the system, the more fragile it becomes, because every convenience hides a dependency, and every dependency is a potential weak point. Here's the twist. We keep calling it progress. But real progress isn't just building new things. It's building resilience. Yet that's the part we always skip. We design for efficiency, not fallback. For growth, not redundancy. We reward speed, not robustness. Why? Because fragility doesn't show up on the balance sheet until it's too late. The 2008 financial crisis. A system built on complex interdependencies and a single market crash triggered global fallout. COVID. A disease outbreak in one country revealed how fragile global supply chains really are. Hospitals ran out of masks. Grocery stores ran out of food. Cities ran out of options. That's the technology trap. Every tool makes life easier and a little more fragile, and we never feel it until the chain snaps. We don't need to reject technology. That's not the lesson, but we do need to remember. The tools are not the strength. The strength is in remembering how to adapt without them, because the next time the lights go out or the network fails, the question won't be what broke. The question will be, did we forget how to live without it? The energy addiction. Every great civilization runs on power, not political power, but physical energy, the kind that moves things, cooks food, builds cities, and lights the night. The earliest empires ran on muscle, human backs, and animal labor. Then came wood and wind, ships with sails, ovens with fire, windmills grinding grain. But those sources had limits, so when a black rock called coal started powering steam engines in the 18th century, the world changed. Coal lit the fuse of the Industrial Revolution. With it came factories, railroads, cities, machines, and a kind of expansion no civilization had ever achieved. Later, oil took over. One barrel of oil holds the energy of 4.5 years of human labor. Think about that. A single tank of gas is the equivalent of enslaving dozens of people to push your car across the country. We don't see it that way because it's invisible, but modern life is built on this hidden energy surplus. And that's where the addiction begins. The more you have, the more you build. The more you build, the more energy you need. And so civilizations grow into these towering systems, not realizing how much they depend on the constant drip of energy. But what happens when the drip stops? When the Romans expanded their empire, they relied on grain shipments from Egypt to feed millions. That was their fuel. When wars and corruption disrupted the supply, cities starved. Rome didn't just fall to enemies, it collapsed under its own metabolic needs. The same pattern repeats. Easter Island had forests, energy in the form of wood. They used it to move massive statues, build canoes, cook food, but they overused it. And when the last tree fell, the society fell with it. Fast forward to now. Modern civilization doesn't run on wood or grain. It runs on oil, coal, natural gas, and electricity. We power everything from hospitals to food production to global trade with energy pulled from beneath the earth. And while we argue about the future, we forget one simple truth. Every major advance, from agriculture to AI, is just a more complex way to use energy. But unlike ancient civilizations, our systems are global, and that makes them more vulnerable. A spike in oil prices doesn't just affect trucks. It affects food, medicine, heating, flights, supply chains, and war. A shortage of lithium, used in batteries, can stall the entire push toward green energy. That's the danger. We think we're progressing towards sustainability, but many of our solutions just shift the dependency from one resource to another. We went from whale oil to petroleum, from horses to cars, from firewood to nuclear. But at every step, the core pattern stays the same. We find a new fuel. We build everything around it. We run it until it breaks. Then we scramble for the next one. And in the background, we rarely ask, what if we didn't just need more energy? What if we needed less dependency? Because energy isn't free. It costs ecosystems, stability, and sometimes entire civilizations. The addiction isn't just to power. It's to growth without limits, without remembering that every system has one. And when that limit is hit, whether through depletion, climate collapse, or political chaos, the fall is sudden, not slow. The lesson: civilizations don't fall when they run out of ideas. They fall when they run out of fuel and realize too late that everything they built required more than they could ever sustain. The progress paradox. Progress feels like freedom. You invent the wheel. Now you don't have to carry things. You invent the car. Now you don't have to walk. You invent the smartphone. Now you don't have to remember anything. It always feels like you're gaining something. But hidden inside every leap forward is something we don't talk about enough. A new chain, a new dependency, a new vulnerability, a new way to get stuck. We're trained to see technology as an escape from limitation. But more often, it just shifts the limitation to someplace harder to notice. Take the washing machine. Incredible invention. It saves hours of labor. But now you need electricity, detergent, a constant water supply, and a machine that breaks after 5 years. You're not free, you're entangled in a new system. Or take agriculture. When humans switched from foraging to farming, they unlocked enormous surpluses. But that progress came with a price. To keep feeding more people, they had to settle, till irrigate, build walls, invent laws, defend territory, tax labor, and create hierarchies. The leap forward created civilization, and with it, oppression, disease, inequality, and war. That's the paradox. Progress doesn't just solve problems, it creates new ones, often more complex, more invisible, and harder to escape. Look at the internet, access to all the world's knowledge. But it also birthed surveillance, algorithmic addiction, attention collapse, and political fragmentation at global scale. Social media gave everyone a voice and made everyone more afraid to speak. GPS means you never get lost, and now no one remembers how to read a map. AI promises efficiency and threatens to erase the very need for human thought in the process. The more we invent, the more we construct environments we can't function without. We don't memorize numbers anymore. We don't navigate by stars. We don't build fires, fix machines, or grow food. Because we've advanced, but are we freer? Or just more dependent on systems we don't understand? Progress, in theory, is a staircase upward, but every step locks the one below it. And if the power goes out, the whole staircase disappears. That's why civilizations collapse faster than they rise. You don't need a war to end an empire. You just need a failure in the system it built itself on. And the most advanced societies are often the most brittle, because the higher you climb, the more specialized everything becomes. And the more specialized it is, the more interconnected, invisible, and fragile the dependencies become. We build for convenience. We pay in resilience. That's the progress paradox. It always feels like we're breaking free until we realize we just swapped one chain for another. And the newest chains, they're the ones you don't feel until they snap. The colony that devoured its mother. Empires are built on a lie that more is always better. More land, more people, more trade routes, more resources. But history tells a different story. Time and time again, the very colonies that empires fought so hard to conquer ended up draining them dry. Let's start with Spain. In the 1500s, Spanish conquistadors flooded into the Americas. They plundered Incan gold, Aztec silver, entire cities' worth of wealth, and shipped it home. By the early 1600s, Spain controlled vast stretches of the globe, from South America to the Philippines. On paper, it was a golden age. But here's what actually happened. The flood of silver into Spain caused massive inflation. Prices skyrocketed. Local industry collapsed. Why bother producing goods when you can just import them with easy silver? The empire became addicted to plunder. And when the mines dried up and the silver slowed, the Spanish economy crumbled. By the time the 18th century rolled around, Spain was broke. Not despite its colonies. Because of them. The British Empire followed a similar arc. By the 19th century, Britain ruled a quarter of the globe. India was called the jewel in the crown, the empire's proudest possession. But maintaining that empire was not cheap. The British taxed Indian farmers into famine. They built massive bureaucracies, railroads, armies, all funded by debt. By World War I, nearly half of Britain's military spending was going toward holding colonies in place. And what did they get in return? Revolts, resistance, and a growing sense of moral rot at the empire's core. It cost more to hold the empire together than it ever returned in profit. France? Same story. Portugal. Worse. Even the Roman Empire, whose entire identity was built around expansion, collapsed under the weight of defending borders that had stretched too far. Because the dark lesson of empire is this: the more you expand, the more fragile you become. Every new territory means more military, more bureaucracy, more enemies, more cultures to control, more revolutions to suppress, more money just to keep the illusion of control going. At some point, you're not profiting from your empire. You're held hostage by it. And here's the modern twist. Today, empires don't wear crowns. They're not always nations. They're corporations, governments, superpowers trying to stretch their influence into every continent, every market, every server. But the cost remains. The U.S. military has over 700 overseas bases. China's Belt and Road Initiative has put entire countries into debt traps. Multinational corporations operate in dozens of countries and face resistance, collapse, lawsuits, and uprisings when local populations push back. The empire still expands. And still the empire is devoured from within, not by barbarians, but by its own unsustainable reach. The slave economy. If you look at a map of the modern world, the richest countries, the most developed economies, it's easy to think hard work built this, innovation, industry, capitalism. But that's not the whole story. The darker truth is this: many of the world's most powerful nations were built on the back of slavery, and not just as a dark chapter. Slavery was the engine, not the side effect, of entire economic systems. Let's be clear, this isn't ancient history. We're talking about the last few centuries, the foundation of modern wealth, industry, and global trade. Start with sugar. In the 17th and 18th centuries, sugar was more valuable than gold. It fueled trade empires, transformed diets, created fortunes, and none of it was possible without enslaved labor. On Caribbean plantations, enslaved Africans worked in brutal conditions, harvesting, processing, and boiling sugarcane in heat and danger, so extreme most didn't survive more than a few years. The average life expectancy for a slave on a sugar plantation in Jamaica, less than 10 years. They weren't workers, they were tools, cheaper to replace than to keep alive. Then there's cotton. The Industrial Revolution, the moment that launched modern capitalism, depended on cheap, mass-produced cotton. And where did that cotton come from? The American South. Millions of enslaved people worked vast cotton fields, day and night. Their labor wasn't just the backbone of Southern agriculture, it fed the factories in Britain and beyond. Manchester's mills, Liverpool's ports, textile empires built on crops picked by hands in chains. It's not an exaggeration to say no slavery, no industrial revolution. The profit margins made it irresistible. And once that kind of money floods in, morality disappears. Banks, insurance companies, shipping firms, all joined in. Slaves were insured like livestock. Families were split and sold like inventory. And even when slavery was outlawed, the logic stayed. Convict leasing, sharecropping, debt bondage, systems were invented to keep labor cheap, rights minimal, and power in the same hands. It didn't end. It evolved. The same logic that justified slavery, maximize output, minimize cost, dehumanize the worker, still infects modern systems. Factories move to countries where labor is cheapest. Migrant workers are trapped in jobs with no protection. Entire industries rely on people too poor, too desperate, or too invisible to fight back. The supply chain that brings you cheap coffee, fast fashion, cheap electronics, still built on suffering. It just doesn't wear chains anymore. And that's the darkest part. When exploitation becomes normal, it hides in plain sight. We tell ourselves slavery was a mistake of the past, but the structure it built, it's still here, just better disguised. The trade that spread death. Trade is supposed to bring progress, new foods, new tools, new ideas, but history doesn't just move in straight lines, it moves in plagues. Every great expansion in human connection has come with an invisible cost: disease. The moment civilizations began sailing across oceans, the world got smaller and far more dangerous. Let's go back to the age of exploration. When European ships arrived in the Americas, they didn't just bring guns and steel, they brought smallpox. The indigenous peoples of the Americas had never been exposed to it, they had no immunity. And the result? Entire civilizations were wiped out, not in battle, but in waves of sickness. In some regions, 90% of the population died, cities emptied without a single shot fired. Families vanished in a matter of weeks. And here's the thing. It wasn't a biological weapon, nobody planned it, but the damage was total. This is what historians now call the Columbian Exchange, the massive transfer of crops, animals, people, and pathogens between the old world and the new. And it wasn't a one-way disaster. When European sailors returned home, they brought back syphilis. It swept across Europe like wildfire, a disease with no known origin but devastating consequences. It wasn't just about germs, it was about global contact. The more connected the world became, the more vulnerable it was. The Silk Road didn't just bring silk, it carried the Black Death, a bacterium hitching a ride in fleas, tucked inside the fur of rats, nestled in wagons and ships. From Central Asia to Europe, the plague spread like a whisper. And then it roared. Between 1347 and 1351, at least one-third of Europe's population died. Entire towns vanished. Economies collapsed. Peasants inherited entire villages simply because no one else was left. Trade routes became death routes, and every time technology made the world faster, the danger scaled with it. Steamships, railroads, airplanes. During the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, World War I troop movements helped the virus leap continents. Faster travel meant faster outbreaks. And in 2020, the same pattern returned. A virus in one city, Wuhan, became a global event in weeks. Not because of malice, because the system is too fast, too dense, too connected to stop. This is the dark irony. The very systems designed to improve life also make us fragile because the next pandemic isn't waiting to be invented. It's already moving, quietly, invisibly, along the same shipping lanes and flight paths that bring us everything we love. And we still haven't figured out how to balance the speed of progress with the cost of vulnerability. Trade brings riches, but it also brings ruin when we forget that connection always carries risk. The Civil War pattern, nations tearing themselves apart from inside. If you look at the grand collapses of history, the real shock isn't how many were invaded, it's how many self-destructed. Not with foreign troops, but with neighbors turning on neighbors. That's the real Civil War pattern, and it's a pattern because it repeats. You don't notice it at first, because it never starts with gunfire. It starts with disgust, a loss of trust, a growing silence. The sense that you're not living in the same country as the people across the street, even if your passport says you are. People stop talking, then they stop listening, then they stop believing the same things. Then they start hating. Once that happens, all it takes is a trigger, a policy, a protest, a leader who realizes division is profitable. The structure is still standing. The courts, the Constitution, the flags, but the people holding it up no longer share a story, and once the shared story breaks, that's when things fall. Let's step back for a moment. Ancient Rome didn't fall all at once. Before the empire cracked, Rome endured civil war after civil war, one general versus another, one idea of Rome against another. By the time the enemies arrived from the outside, Rome had already torn itself in half more than once. Same with France in the 18th century. Same with China in the early 20th. Same with the United States in 1861. You don't need foreign invaders to bring chaos. Just enough people who'd rather see the whole thing burn than admit they were wrong. And the irony? Most civil wars start with people believing they're saving their country. Both sides say it. Both sides think they're protecting the real version of their nation. But when two groups both believe they have exclusive rights to the truth, dialogue becomes impossible. So what happens? Each side creates its own facts, its own media, its own version of history, its own heroes, its own villains, and soon the other side isn't just wrong. They're evil. That's the final stage. Not disagreement, not debate. Dehumanization. You stop arguing with someone and start trying to destroy them. And the tragedy. Everyone thinks it's temporary, that once their side wins, things will go back to normal. But they rarely do. Because once the blood spills, once the old bonds are broken, a nation doesn't reset, it reshapes. Sometimes into something better, often into something worse, and most of the time, into something smaller, weaker, angrier. Civil wars don't just change who's in charge, they change what people are willing to believe. They scar memory. They divide families for generations. They make people afraid to speak, even long after the guns go quiet. This is why it matters. Not because some conflict is inevitable, but because every generation thinks it can't happen again, that they're too smart, too modern, too civilized. But the cracks are never gone, just hidden, waiting. The next time a country collapses, it might not be from invasion. It might be because it couldn't agree with itself, and it turned that disagreement into fire. The borders drawn in blood. Why some of the worst conflicts never had a chance to be avoided. Imagine this. Someone walks into your neighborhood, a complete outsider, and decides, arbitrarily, where your yard ends and your neighbor's begins. Not because you fought over it, not because there was any problem, just because it's easier for them to draw a line. Now imagine that same line splits families, languages, communities, entire ways of life. Suddenly you're on the other side of a border, and the people you grew up with are now foreigners. Now imagine this isn't just your street. It's an entire continent. That's what happened to much of the world. A lot of the conflicts we see today, the civil wars, the refugee crises, the ethnic tensions that make the headlines, didn't just erupt out of nowhere. They were baked into the borders themselves. In the 19th and 20th centuries, powerful countries carved up weaker ones like puzzle pieces. Colonial powers sat around tables and divided land they didn't live in and didn't understand, drawing borders on maps based on convenience, not culture. And when those empires collapsed, the lines stayed, even if they made no sense. So now countries were filled with groups that didn't speak the same language, didn't follow the same religion, didn't share the same history, and were expected to function as one. Or worse, people who did belong together got split into different countries, now forced to live under governments that didn't represent them. The outcome was predictable: tension, mistrust, violence. But here's the part people miss. Once a border is drawn, it becomes real, even if it started as a mistake. Even if nobody on the ground agreed to it, it becomes something to defend, to fight over, to die for. That's how artificial lines become lifelong wars, and it's not just history. Look at the world map today. Some of the most fragile places, the ones always in conflict, are still stuck with borders they never chose, drawn in someone else's interest, maintained by force, not consent. And yet, every time a new conflict starts, we act surprised, like it's about religion, or tribalism, or ideology. But sometimes, it's just a line that should never have been there. The deeper lesson. When you divide people without listening to them, when you prioritize control over understanding, when you treat land like a spreadsheet instead of a living culture, you don't just create a map, you create a fuse. And history has shown, again and again, it will eventually be lit. The price of cheapness. Walk into a store today and look at a shirt that costs $5. $5. You already know the thread didn't magically spin itself, the cotton didn't harvest itself, and the fabric didn't sew itself into perfect shape on a shelf in your local mall. So somewhere, somehow, that cost was offloaded. Not eliminated, just moved. Maybe it was paid in the call-used hands of someone working 14 hours a day in a factory that doesn't have fire exits. Maybe it was paid by a river in Bangladesh now running indigo blue with chemical dye. Maybe it was paid by a child who dropped out of school because her family needed another set of hands in the sewing line. But you didn't see it. You just saw the price tag. And this is the magic of cheapness. It's not just about lower numbers. It's about hiding the cost. And we've built entire economies on top of that illusion. During the Industrial Revolution, the price of cloth plummeted. But it wasn't magic. It was powered by colonial cotton picked by enslaved labor, shipped across seas, processed in mills where children worked dangerous looms for a few cents a week. The system worked brilliantly. if you never look down. And today, we haven't changed the system. We've just outsourced the guilt. We like to think of the modern world as one of progress and compassion. We talk about justice and equity. But when something is cheap enough, we stop asking where it came from. It's not just clothing. It's electronics. It's food. It's shipping. It's attention. Free apps. They cost you your privacy. Cheap delivery. It costs someone else their body. Low-cost flights. It costs the climate. Fast fashion. It costs the planet. There's no such thing as a free lunch. But there's always someone else we hope will pick up the tab. And what's worse, we've learned to expect cheapness as a right. A phone breaks in 2 years. That's fine. A new one is waiting for $399. A shirt rips. Throw it out. A machine needs repair. It's cheaper to replace. We're no longer taught to care about how long something lasts, only how little it costs. And entire industries have evolved to make sure the real cost stays out of sight. But cheapness is never neutral. Because every time something gets cheaper than it should be, it means someone else is getting less than they deserve. Less safety, less air, less future, less voice, and slowly, a culture forms. One where the value of a thing is just the number on the tag, and by extension, the value of a person becomes the number on their wage slip. In the end, cheapness isn't about price, it's about distance. Distance from the sweat. Distance from the waste, distance from the destruction, but history has a way of closing that distance. Slowly, then all at once. When the land dies, when the workers revolt, when the debt comes due, because eventually someone has to pay. And when there's no one left to squeeze, the system collapses. That's what we keep forgetting. The city that drank itself dry. There was a city once, out in the desert. It had shining temples, deep canals, art on its walls, grain in its granaries. It was the kind of place that looked eternal, not just surviving but thriving. And then it disappeared. No war, no invasion, no sudden disaster. It just couldn't support itself anymore. The rivers dried, the soil turned to dust. And the city that had once controlled nature forgot that it depended on it. That city could have been Ur, or Nineveh, or Angkor Wat, or Vegas, or Phoenix, or any of us. Because here's the part we always forget. You can build a brilliant civilization in a place that can't survive one. All it takes is borrowed time. You tap into water deep underground, aquifers that took thousands of years to fill. You farm land that was fertile once but fragile. You grow faster than your surroundings can handle. You forget that infrastructure has an expiration date. And eventually, the environment sends the bill. The warning signs are never loud at first. A few wells dry up. Food costs rise. The air gets worse. People start getting sick more often. But nothing crashes, so nothing changes. Until it does. And then, it's too late. The strange thing is, these cities were smart. They had engineers, priests, planners, scholars. They built monuments to their own brilliance. They even knew the signs of decline, but they kept pushing anyway. Because growth always feels right, even when it's heading straight off a cliff. Today we build cities in deserts, pipe water across entire states, grow avocados in drought zones, and act surprised when reservoirs drop to record lows. We frack and drain and overfarm and act like the market will figure it out. But markets don't care about aquifers, prophets don't know what climate means, and civilizations don't tend to collapse with a warning bell. They fade, then break, then vanish, and the people left behind look around and say, "How could we not have seen this coming?" We think we're smarter than the past. We think our technology will save us. But every dead city thought the same thing. They didn't die because they were stupid. They died because they were brilliant, but short-sighted, because they confused temporary abundance with sustainability, because they drank too deeply from a cup that didn't refill fast enough. The lesson is not just about water, it's about limits and how we ignore them when we're winning. the fields that turn to dust. You don't need a war to end a civilization. You don't need a plague, a comet, or an invasion. Sometimes all it takes is a field that stops growing food. And history has seen it again and again, quietly, almost invisibly. The land beneath your feet becomes the enemy. And it's not because the earth changed. It's because we did. Let's talk about Mesopotamia, the so-called cradle of civilization. They built canals, harnessed the rivers, irrigated the deserts. Incredible, right? And then the soil turned salty. Why? Because irrigating hot, dry land without proper drainage builds up salt. Salt that nothing can grow in. The wheat stopped growing. They switched to barley. Then barley failed too. Thousands of years of brilliance, undone by the slow death of the land. It didn't happen overnight. That's the trap. At first, you get more crops. Then, a few bad harvests. Then, maybe a famine every few decades. Then the cities get smaller. Then the empire disappears. And by the time someone notices, the topsoil's already blown halfway across the continent. It wasn't just Mesopotamia. The Maya overfarmed hillsides and triggered erosion. The Romans deforested North Africa, turning fertile plains into dust. Even 20th century America fell for it. The Dust Bowl. Farmers were told, plow more, plant more, profit more, but no one taught them the soil could run out of life. By the 1930s, huge parts of the Great Plains turned into choking clouds of dust. Children died of dust and pneumonia. Entire towns vanished. And this happened not in ancient times, but in the age of cars and radios. The modern world brought to its knees by dirt. And here's the disturbing part. We're doing it again. In Brazil, the Amazon is being stripped bare for cattle and soy. In China, once fertile regions are now deserts creeping outward. Even in California, crops are pumped full of water from aquifers that won't refill for centuries. Because the logic of growth has no memory, soil takes centuries to form and minutes to destroy. Monocultures, over-fertilization, chemical runoff, erosion, these are not ancient problems, they are modern ones, and they're growing. We think of collapse as sudden, but ecological collapse is slow, silent, and patient. It hides behind record profits, behind full supermarkets, behind short-term yields that mask long-term death. And once the soil dies, so does everything else. Civilizations are not built on stone, they're built on dirt. On 6 inches of fragile topsoil, and every single one that forgot that is gone. What makes this so dangerous is how invisible it feels. You can't hear the soil dying. You don't notice it missing until you're hungry. We don't learn this in school. We should, because it's not just history, it's a warning, and the ground is already whispering it again. The empire that couldn't see itself dying. It's a strange thing when a civilization reaches its peak. The people inside it often believe they've escaped history. The streets are crowded. The markets are full. The buildings get taller. The art more elaborate. The language more confident. And the elite begin to talk not about survival, but about destiny. That's when you should worry. Because history shows us something disturbing. Collapse doesn't wait until after the glory. Collapse begins during the glory. Take the Roman Empire. Most people imagine its fall as something obvious, a slow decay after centuries of corruption. But if you were alive in the 2nd century, during the reign of Marcus Aurelius, it didn't feel like decline. It felt like triumph. The empire stretched from Britain to the Middle East. Trade routes flowed, tax revenues soared. Public baths, libraries, and stadiums were everywhere. Philosophy flourished. And yet, the seeds of collapse were already rooted deep. The army was overextended. The economy depended on conquest. The bureaucracy bloated. The gap between rich and poor became grotesque, and the people, lulled by comfort, stopped paying attention. But who would notice? When your empire is still building marble monuments and holding festivals for the gods, it doesn't look like decline. And so they ignored it. They didn't see the empire was hollowing out, that loyalty was fading, that the institutions were weakening, that the future was built on assumptions that no longer held. Because collapse never looks like collapse from the inside. It looks like politics. It looks like budget debates. It looks like rising crime in faraway provinces. It looks like louder voices on the streets and leaders making bigger promises. It looks like normal life, just a little more unstable each year. And by the time the borders fall, or the economy breaks, or the center can no longer hold, the people don't say, "Ah, this is the end." They say, "This is just a phase. It'll pass," until it doesn't. Now here's the uncomfortable part. This isn't just about Rome. It's not just about the Mayans, or the Tang dynasty, or the British Empire. It's about now. Because no civilization ever thought it was going to collapse. Every one of them had reasons to feel invincible, to believe they were too advanced, too modern, too big to fail. And those are exactly the civilizations that fall the hardest. If you want to know when collapse is coming, don't look for signs of weakness. Look for signs of arrogance. Look for the moment when questioning becomes unpatriotic. When nostalgia replaces curiosity, when criticism is seen as betrayal, when people stop asking, "Is this sustainable?" and start saying, "This is the way it's always been." Because the greatest empires don't die from invasion. They die from blindness, from refusing to see the cracks beneath their own greatness. And history doesn't need you to believe this. It just needs you to remember all the others thought they were different too. The barbarian at the gate. When things fall apart, we look for someone to blame. Something crashes, the economy, a company, a country, and people immediately turn to the easiest explanation. It was them, outsiders, foreigners, competitors, newcomers, the barbarians at the gate. It's comforting, isn't it? To think that we were fine, and then they came and ruined everything. But history and reality don't usually work like that. Let's say a business fails. Most of the time, the company points at the market, the competition, the economy. But dig deeper, and what you usually find is rot, missed warnings, bad leadership, internal dysfunction. They were already bleeding out before anyone threw the first punch. Now scale that up to a country. When Rome collapsed, they blamed the barbarians. But what most people didn't want to admit was that Rome had been hollowing out from the inside for decades. Corrupt elites, broken institutions, armies that only fought for money. A public so tired of the system, they stopped believing in it. The invaders didn't destroy Rome. They just showed up at the end when no one cared enough to fight back. And that story, it keeps happening. Look at any crisis, political, economic, social, and you'll find people pointing fingers outward. Immigrants, globalization, foreign influence, whatever's easiest to blame. But the most dangerous problems aren't foreign. They're familiar. It's the company that ignored its own toxic culture, the government that silenced criticism until it was too late, the relationships that fell apart not because of someone else, but because no one inside was honest about what was breaking. Blaming the barbarian is a distraction. It makes collapse feel like an attack, like something sudden. But it's not. Collapse is slow. It's invisible. It's the slow leak you didn't patch, the habit you didn't break, the warnings you called exaggeration. By the time the threat is visible, the real damage is already done, and deep down you knew. That's the lesson we keep avoiding. It's never just the outsider. It's the decay we didn't want to see, the weakness we refused to name, the problems we laughed off until the knock at the door. And when the door finally opens, we act surprised. The collapse without warning. When civilizations vanish overnight, we assume civilizations crumble with clear signs: war, plague, revolution, environmental catastrophe. But some of the most advanced societies in history disappeared quietly. No dramatic ending, no final battle, No clear reason, just silence. And it's that silence that should disturb us. Let's start with something few people learn in school, the story of Cahokia. It was the largest city in North America before Columbus ever arrived. Right near modern-day St. Louis, Cahokia was a sophisticated urban center with enormous earthen mounds, wooden palisades, complex trade networks, and possibly 20,000 residents, which made it larger than London in the 1200s. But sometime after the 1300s, Cahokia was abandoned, not destroyed, not invaded, just emptied. People left, and historians still don't fully know why. It wasn't unique. Thousands of miles away, in South Asia, the Indus Valley civilization was another advanced society, with planned cities, plumbing, drainage systems, and standardized weights and measures, more than 4,000 years ago. These weren't isolated villages. They were complex urban societies with engineering more advanced than some parts of the world have today. And yet by 1900 BCE, the entire civilization was gone, not conquered, not destroyed, just gone. What happened? There are guesses. Climate change, shifting rivers, droughts, soil depletion, political fragmentation. But the most unsettling possibility is this: the collapse may have felt like nothing at all to the people living through it. No alarms, no explosions. Just a slow breakdown where things gradually stopped working until normal life became impossible. And this is where the dark lesson begins. Because it turns out, civilizations don't need a disaster to collapse. They just need enough small problems to go unsolved, long enough until the structure stops holding itself together. Sometimes it's environmental, like forests cut down too quickly or irrigation systems that salt the soil. Sometimes it's political, like leadership that becomes too rigid or corrupt to adapt. Sometimes it's economic, like trade networks breaking or inequality reaching unsustainable levels. But the real danger isn't any single factor. It's the illusion of stability, the belief that just because things have always worked, they always will. Cahokia didn't fall because someone burned it down. It fell because its people assumed the system was fine until it wasn't. And that's the part that's relatable today. Because when we think of collapse, we think of a massive, visible event, a dramatic war, a giant economic crash, a disaster headline. But most of the time, collapse is boring. It looks like decaying infrastructure we stop fixing. It looks like fewer young people being able to afford homes. It looks like public services quietly deteriorating while nobody notices. It looks like fewer people voting, fewer people trusting, fewer people caring, and by the time the consequences become impossible to ignore, the momentum is already gone. This is why the idea of collapse without warning isn't about history. It's about right now. When people say things feel like they're falling apart, they're not always talking about violence or disaster. They're talking about small cracks appearing in trust, in systems, in day-to-day life. And most of us are trained to ignore them. We assume someone else will fix it, that it's not that bad, that things will go back to normal. But what if this is the collapse? Not the end, but the unraveling that happens before anyone realizes the ending has begun. That's what Cahokia teaches us. Not that civilizations fall, but that they often fall silently. And if we don't learn that, we risk repeating it, believing everything's fine until there's nothing left to fix. The last banquet, elites partying, while the world burns. Imagine you're a ruler in a glittering city. Your palace is full of wine, music, gold. The streets outside, not so much. People are hungry. Crops have failed. Prices are rising. But inside, things look fine. You're dining on imported meat, entertained by foreign performers, sipping wine from across the sea. You know things are tense, but come on, it's not your problem. This isn't just a metaphor. In the final days of ancient Rome, while the empire was crumbling at its edges, many of the elites were throwing their biggest feasts ever. They weren't cutting back. They were doubling down, more luxury, bigger shows. lavish games, public spectacles. Meanwhile, the army was underpaid, the currency was collapsing, and borders were unraveling. You'd think they'd be panicking, but they weren't. Not really. Because collapse never feels real when you're insulated from the consequences. You see this pattern over and over again. In pre-revolution France, the aristocracy still held opulent balls in Versailles while people starved in the streets. Marie Antoinette's infamous "let them eat cake" line may be a myth, but the sentiment wasn't. They genuinely believed the crisis was exaggerated. How bad could things be if we are still living well? In pre-revolution Russia, the Tsar and his court were dining in palaces while soldiers were freezing at the front. They spent fortunes on Fabergé eggs, hunting parties, and imported delicacies, while entire regions faced famine. And when the revolution came, it came fast. This isn't about blaming luxury, it's about disconnect. When the people in charge no longer feel the pain of the people beneath them, warning signs get ignored. And when those at the top believe their comfort is proof everything is okay, they stop listening. Even in the 20th century, we saw it. Before the 2008 financial crash, CEOs and bankers held record-breaking parties while the housing bubble swelled. Yachts, bonuses, champagne. Then millions lost homes, jobs, and savings. And those same elites got bailed out. It wasn't just economic failure. It was a failure to see reality. Because when systems start to break, the people who benefit from them are the last to notice, and often the last to suffer. The last banquet isn't always literal. It can be a corporate retreat during a crisis, a political fundraiser during a natural disaster, a tech launch while entire cities are underwater, and the real danger. The party feels normal. That's what makes it terrifying. From inside the palace, it just feels like another Tuesday. The music plays. The candles glow. The roast is delicious. Outside, the fire has already started. But you can't hear it through the walls. The lesson isn't that wealth is evil. It's that isolation from consequence breeds blindness. When you stop feeling what others are feeling, when your comfort becomes your measure of truth, you're no longer leading, you're drifting. And when the crash comes, it always feels sudden to those who never looked outside. The lesson of forgetting, why history always repeats. It's easy to imagine that history is behind us, that the horrors we read about belong to another time. Darker, simpler, more primitive. But history is not something that happened. It's something that keeps happening. Most civilizations didn't fall because they lacked intelligence, technology, or even resources. They fell because they forgot. They forgot the very things that once made them great. And worse, they believed they were too advanced to fail. Take the ancient Greeks. After centuries of progress in philosophy, science, mathematics, they collapsed not just from external pressures but from internal decay. Their successors, the Romans, learned from them for a while. Then Rome forgot. It became bloated with bureaucracy, obsessed with entertainment, disillusioned with civic duty. Sound familiar? After Rome fell, the Western world forgot things so basic we now take them for granted. Concrete, plumbing, glass-making, even how to read certain texts. In just a few generations, knowledge that took centuries to build was simply gone. Libraries were burned, books lost, teachers silenced. The Dark Ages weren't just dark. They were blind. But what caused the forgetting? Comfort, arrogance, and time. When things work, we stop asking why. When systems run, we stop maintaining them. When peace holds, we forget how fragile it is. We imagine ourselves as immune to collapse because we have smartphones, satellites, and AI. But every society thought it was the pinnacle of civilization until it wasn't. We confuse information with wisdom, access with understanding, progress with immunity. Even today, we're already forgetting recent lessons. Financial crises, a decade old, are now background noise. The warning signs of climate instability are normalized. Pandemics fade into the background of convenience, and this isn't accidental. Entire industries are built to make you forget. News cycles reset every 24 hours. Algorithms keep you scrolling, not thinking. Even school curriculums often skip the most uncomfortable truths. We say never again after every atrocity, then again comes faster than we expect. The worst part: the more comfortable a generation becomes, the more likely it is to believe that the past has nothing to teach them, and that is the exact moment when the cycle resets. Forgetting is not just passive, it's dangerous. Because what we forget, we are doomed to repeat, with better branding and a faster Wi-Fi connection. So if it feels like the world is circling familiar disasters, it's not a coincidence. It's memory loss. And history doesn't forgive amnesia. It just waits and repeats. The cycle of hubris, power always planting the seeds of downfall. There's a strange pattern that shows up again and again in history. A civilization becomes powerful. That power breeds confidence. That confidence turns into arrogance. And that arrogance leads to blindness until the very thing that made them strong becomes the reason they collapse. It's not about bad luck. It's not just invasion, disaster, or economics. It's about something much simpler. They thought they couldn't fall. Take any major power in history: the Romans, the British Empire, the Soviet Union, even modern superpowers, and you'll see this exact cycle. At first they rise through hardship. They fight, innovate, adapt. They're cautious because they remember failure. But once they succeed, they stop questioning themselves. They build monuments to their greatness. They write laws assuming they'll last forever. And they start seeing new ideas, or outsiders, as threats. When people try to raise alarms, they get ignored. You're being negative. You're unpatriotic. You're overreacting. That's how hubris works. It convinces you that past success guarantees future safety, and that anyone who doubts the system must be wrong. Let's get specific. Before the 2008 financial crisis, banks believed their models were invincible. They had data, algorithms, confidence. But they also had trillions in high-risk debt hidden behind nice packaging. When it collapsed, they were shocked, even though many had warned them. Why didn't they listen? Because the system had worked until it didn't. That's hubris. It's the same mindset that built the Titanic and called it unsinkable. The same mindset that led major oil companies to dismiss climate science for decades. The same mindset that let empires spread thin, convinced their dominance would last forever. But here's the truth. The moment you believe you can't fail, you've already started failing. That's the cruel irony. Success feels like safety, but it's often the most dangerous time. Because when things are going well, we stop being careful. We stop listening. We start cutting corners, skipping backups, trusting the system blindly, and slowly, cracks form. Small at first, easy to ignore. Until one day they're everywhere, and by then it's too late. We see this in companies, in governments, in technologies, even in individuals. Think about someone who skyrockets to success. Maybe they work hard at first, stay humble, but once they're on top, they stop learning. They surround themselves with yes men. They believe their own hype, and then collapse. The cycle of hubris is always the same. It whispers, "You've made it," and then makes sure you never see what's coming next. That's why every civilization needs doubt, needs critics, needs uncomfortable questions. Because real strength isn't just power. It's the ability to question your power before it betrays you. The warning of the ruins. Why we stare at fallen civilizations yet follow them. Every year, millions of people stand in the shadow of ruins. We walk through collapsed temples, shattered columns, broken cities. We stare up at pyramids, amphitheaters, crumbling statues. We call them wonders of the world. We marvel at how advanced they were, and then we get on a plane and go home, unchanged. But we miss something important. Those ruins weren't just buildings, they were warning signs. Messages written in stone, whispering the same thing. They thought it would last forever, too. The ancient world didn't see itself as ancient. Rome didn't think it would fall. The Maya didn't know their cities would be swallowed by jungle. The people who built Angkor Wat didn't plan for silence. To them, the future looked like growth. More temples, more trade, more power. They didn't see the collapse coming, not because they were stupid, but because they were human. And humans are terrible at recognizing when we're repeating mistakes. We see environmental destruction, political corruption, widening inequality, and assume it's a modern problem. But go back far enough, and you'll find the same themes. Civilizations overextend. They ignore early signs. They silence dissent. They use up their resources. They forget how fragile they are. And when they finally realize the danger, it's already too late. But here's the strangest part. We know all this. We literally teach it. School children memorize the fall of Rome. We make documentaries about Easter Island, Pompeii, the Bronze Age collapse. We study the ruins, but we never learn from them, because ruins are easier to photograph than to listen to. They're aesthetic now, Instagrammable. We frame them as artifacts, not as consequences, and we convince ourselves that we're different. We have technology, we have global trade, we have knowledge, but so did they. They had writing, mathematics, engineering, vast empires, diplomacy, and yet they still collapsed. Not because they lacked intelligence, but because they didn't know what to do with it. Sound familiar? We build smarter phones, faster networks, more powerful machines, but we still struggle with the same old flaws: greed, denial, short-term thinking, ego, fear. We are not separate from history. We are not immune to collapse. And if we treat the past like a museum, not a mirror, we will become the next exhibit. So next time you walk among the ruins, don't just ask, "How did this fall?" Ask, "How close are we to becoming the next one?" That's the end of this journey. If something in this series made you think differently, share it in the comments. Because maybe, just maybe, awareness is the only thing that's ever saved anyone from repeating history.